Hello.
How's it going this morning?
Good morning. Yeah, doing good. How are you doing? We got two clip for 7:15. Lindsey Graham first, and a weed second. Gotcha. One minute.
Listening to Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
Fault lines.
Live from across the divided states of America, it is time now for another edition of the most disruptive show covering news, events, politics, and more from across those states as well as across the surface of our globe. In the independent corner, I am your political analyst, Shane Stranahan.
And in the left corner, I am the indefatigable, a burning ember in the darkness, your political analyst, Jamarl Thomas.
And together we are Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. All right, going into the headlines this morning. First up in COVID news, at least 1,777 new coronavirus deaths and 208,000 new cases were reported in the United States yesterday, January 10th. Over the past week, there has been an average of 254,000 cases per day. That's an increase of 38% from the average of 2 weeks earlier, and almost 375,000 people have died. New York City opened 2 massive COVID-19 vaccination hubs Sunday. The sites will be operating 24/7 until everyone in New York is vaccinated. Doctors, until in New York City is vaccinated, to be clear. Doctors, nurses, COVID testing, and inoculation staffers, and nursing home employees and residents have already gotten the green light for vaccination. Today, school employees, including teachers, first responders such as police and firefighters, and public transit workers, are allowed to begin getting vaccinated. As of Saturday overnight, fewer than half the vaccines that the city has received had been doled out, or 203,000 out of 524,000. Of those 203,000, about 185,000 were the first dose. So a second dose will be needed. That'll bring it up to about 370,000, but that can wait some weeks. Johnson & Johnson is expected to deliver preliminary late-stage trial results for its one-dose COVID vaccine candidate by the end of January. If its jab is proven to be safe and effective, the company aims to deliver at least 1 billion doses by the end of the year. House lawmakers may have been exposed to someone testing positive for COVID-19 while they sheltered at an undisclosed location during the Capitol siege by a violent mob loyal to President Donald Trump. The Capitol's attending physician notified all lawmakers Sunday of the virus exposure and urged them to be tested. The infected individual was not named. In national political news, House Speaker Nancy Pelosi announced the House will be moving forward with a resolution to impeach President Trump, referring to the president in a letter to colleagues as a quote-unquote imminent threat to the U.S. Constitution and democracy. On Monday, House leaders will work to swiftly pass legislation to do that. If it is blocked by Republicans, which is almost certain, the House will convene for a full House vote on Tuesday. Pelosi explained that the resolution calls on VP Mike Pence to, quote, convene and mobilize the cabinet to activate the 25th Amendment to declare the president incapable of executing the duties of his office, end quote. Under the procedure, the vice president would, quote, immediately exercise powers as acting president, end quote. Trump is due to leave office anyway on January 20th. 2 U.S. Capitol police officers are now dead as a result of the Capitol siege. Bran Sicknick, who suffered injuries during the riot on Wednesday and succumbed to those injuries the following day on Thursday, and now Howard Levengood, who committed suicide on Saturday. Levengood was a 15-year veteran who responded to the Capitol riot in the halls of Congress. The U.S. Capitol Police are not directly linking Levengood's death to Wednesday's riots, as he was off duty when he killed himself. Not that I'm sure that makes much of a difference. The 2022 PGA Championship, which had been scheduled since 2014 to be played at Trump National in Bedminster, will not take place there in the wake of the outbreak of violence at the Capitol. The PGA of America, the governing body for the major championship, on Sunday voted to move the event from the New Jersey golf course because of its ties with Trump. And this is a big one that I'm sure most folks saw. On Friday, Twitter permanently banned Trump from the social media platform, citing the risk that he would incite further violence. Adamant supporter of Trump, radio host Rush Limbaugh then deactivated his own Twitter account. Trump's personal attorney, Rudy Giuliani, has appeared on Steve Bannon's YouTube podcast, War Room. He placed blame on the Democratic Party for Wednesday's Capitol siege, arguing that it was orchestrated to make Trump look bad. A few hours later, YouTube removed the episode and banned Steve Bannon's podcast channel, War Room, altogether. And in related news, and I'm going to go to you, Jamarl, Parler, a social media app popular with conservatives and supporters of President Donald Trump, has gone offline after Amazon withdrew its support in the wake of the deadly U.S. Capitol riot. The app was reliant on cloud computing power provided by Amazon Web Services. AWS told Parler on Saturday that it will no longer provide cloud services to the company beginning on Sunday at 11:59 p.m. Pacific. John Matzey, the founder and CEO, said in a statement on Monday that the Parler app will be down, quote unquote, longer than expected, because other cloud hosting companies do not want to work with Parler in light of the press statements issued by Amazon, Google, and Apple. Apple removed Parler from the iPhone App Store on Saturday. The company said that posts on Parler related to the U.S. Capitol riot included calls for violence, which violates Apple's rules against objectionable content. And now, Jamarl, I'm going to turn to you. What is your take on the banning of Twitter, on the AWS deplatforming of Parler, and the subsequent apparent deplatforming of that app as a whole? If no cloud service is going to give them a server, if people don't want to work with them, then that's the sort of widespread, tacit cultural boycott of them. What's your take on this whole phenomenon? What do you think?
So this is always a little strange, and we need to grapple. We have issues of free speech we need to grapple with that we've never really come to and fully understanding of. The Parler thing is fascinating because this is kind of capitalism intersecting kind of the cultural environment, which it does anyway, but it's doing so in this kind of overt way, not like a fish in water. The Parler thing is also fascinating because Trump moves the Parler, after Facebook, Twitter, Snapchat, basically the tech sector, banishes him, and then they get rid of Parler. Like, I have qualms with this, and we really need to wonder and question whether or not we're okay with this kind of blacklisting. Was Trump calling for violence? Yes, I think so. And I think all of the violence and everything else was infinitely foreseeable, going all the way back for months on end, when he didn't concede, when he came up with the conspiracy theories and everything else. We need to come to terms with this intersection point between when is free speech too far. Meaning, if I say, let's go and murder Todd at 6 o'clock, well, clearly that's too far. But what if you don't say, let's go murder Todd? What if you say, let's go meet up at this very specific place? When contextually, when you guys get together, you're probably going to go and try to get Todd. Does that one constitute an issue of free speech, or is it just the overt, let's go and kill Todd? I don't think we've grappled with this. I mean, the free speech stuff, in other countries, we don't have this kind of free speech law. But the free speech is purely from the standpoint of government, not from the standpoint of private companies. And that's kind of the issue. Also, Section 230 gives them the ability to get rid of the various people if they believe that it's violent speech. I have qualms with getting rid of the president from the United States off the social media. I just do. I think it's weird. It's bizarre. It's not like the president doesn't have other platforms that the president can go on. This is strange to me. And I think this is something that's going to bite us later. I mean, they could have done this to BLM. I mean, maybe not, because from that standpoint, BLM was kind of on the positive side of this. But if you were looking at, and I mean from the standpoint of the way society is looking at it, the way media is looking at it, but if this was the 60s and they started looking at blacks as domestic terrorists, oh man. Yeah, I have qualms with this. But it's hard to articulate because I think it's not as clear cut as some people make it with free speech extremists. I think those people are just being lazy. I think the due diligence or the real hard work of it all is trying to figure out where's the line, if there is a line. And does this cross the line, or has Trump crossed the line? And does that demand social media companies basically eliminate him off of social media? And if the issue, honestly, gets to that, then really the question you're talking about is whether or not there should be some kind of law or governmental control where social media companies become more of a like a phone company or something, or like a utility or something. I mean, it seems like this is the conversation that we keep hitting our heads on, with this notion of whether or not they can get rid of free speech, whether or not social media companies should be the end-all, be-all in determining who they get rid of and who they don't. By the same token, these are private companies, so private companies have a say-so in regards to who they have on their sites. Now, I don't think this is all that straightforward. And I think this is going to be a complication that's going to eat us going forward for the next several months, if not years.
Yeah, or decades. Yeah, I agree with you on that point. You framed it in terms of one question, which is what kinds of speech should be free, and that the answer is not every kind of speech, but the answer, I think, in America traditionally is most kinds of speech, and what people see is more kinds of speech being labeled as not deserving of freedom, if that's not a dorky enough way to put it for you. Specifically, like if Trump, if it's not let's march on Bob's or Paul's, I forget which name you chose. But if it's not let's kill Bob or Paul, but like let's march on Bob or Paul, if that's what you're saying, which is effectively what Trump said, on the day of, in advance of this, and his team making slightly more clear but similarly dog whistly statements, if those shouldn't be free, if it's not an explicit threat, but if it's a sort of implicit threat, what degree of implicitness are you going to start to punish? There's no, as far as I can tell, there is no clear answer to that problem, because as soon as you get into implicit communication, you're dealing with degrees of subtlety and degrees of reflection that you can just take on indefinitely. And so the sort of tyrannical interpretation of speech, that's one aspect I'm worried about. Another big problem here, and that's sort of how I would characterize what what your complaint there was, Jamarl, or what you were pointing out as a main sort of enigmatic thing that we need to work through as a society. The other thing is, like, what deplatforming means, and if that is valid, to what extent that's valid. Here's where I'm going with this. If Twitter bans Trump, then he goes to another platform. if App Stores ban the app that he would have chosen as his replacement, then maybe you host your own website, you do something independent of it. If your server services are banning your app, what do you have to do? Like recreate your own internet? I saw somebody posting this. This isn't my take, but like that is effectively where you're going. There are increasing degrees of isolation and an increasing burden placed on people as they're expected to not be able to use these sort of de facto creations of the common weal, the common good, the sort of, just the commons in a weird way, which these companies are. That's the whole point of calling a lot of these companies platforms, is that they're taken as a sort of public service. And so being denied that public service is tantamount to, being denied a platform in a very real, basic, almost human rights-y sense. But I also don't want to defend Trump calling on people to, incite an uprising, or his team trying to call people to incite an uprising in the States.
So
Jamarl.
Yeah, it's not easy.
Exactly.
It's not easy mending that gap, because there's something problematic with what's taking place. By the same token, it feels weird defending the other position, because basically the other position is Donald Trump screaming for a revolution. It's very strange. It's very, very strange. I think this is the intersection between what does it mean to have free speech, and that's a governmental thing, as opposed to companies. And I agree with you, this idea that these things are supposed to be public goods, and so because they're public goods, there's an element of this that's supposed to be an open platform for conversation, etc. But that's always murky. That has always been a murky area. But please continue with the headlines.
And even what's that?
Well, I was going to say continue the headlines if you wanted to go. I just interjected, but please.
Oh yeah, sure. We got a few more here. Let's just close these out, and we'll have time to exit. On the other side, politician Sadir Japarov is on course to a landslide victory in Kyrgyzstan's snap presidential election, which was triggered by the collapse of the previous government. He has won almost 80% of the vote on Sunday in the Central Asian nation. Japarov, who was sentenced to a lengthy prison term for kidnapping a provincial governor as part of a protest, had his verdict quashed amid the October unrest and has outspent 16 presidential poll rivals by a wide margin. A Sriwijaya airplane, a Boeing 737-500, that's an Indonesian passenger jet with 62 people on board, crashed into the ocean on Saturday. Only 4 minutes into the flight, the plane dropped 10,000 feet in less than a minute and then disappeared from the radar. Rescuers have located the plane's black box flight recorder and obtained communications data. More details will come soon regarding the cause of the crash. And Facebook, in our last headline, has taken down a network in Uganda linked to the country's Ministry of Information for reportedly using fake and duplicate accounts to post ahead of this week's presidential election on Thursday, which pits longtime leader Yoweri Museveni against 10 candidates, including opposition front-runner Bobi Wine, a singer-turned-lawmaker whose star power has rattled the ruling party. And with that, those are our headlines. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. And there's room for plenty of conversation here, but we got to go into a break, and we will be back on the other side with Jamarl's Soapbox segment. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Be right back.
Fault Lines.
What's the most important hour of the day? It's the Critical Hour with Dr. Wilmer Leon. On this show, we don't just deliver the latest headlines, we divide the real from the fake. Tune in to hear from some of the most brilliant political minds of today, get in-depth news and analysis that goes beyond the surface and dig straight into the details. Set your clock to the Critical Hour for a news perspective unlike any of those other guys. Tune in to the Critical Hour with Dr. Wilmer Leon, weekdays 6 to 7 p.m. Eastern, and catch us on Facebook Live. You're listening to Radio Sputnik.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined by my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in Washington, D.C. If you guys live in the area, you can catch us on radio at 105.5 FM and 1390 AM. We're also in Kansas City at 102.9 FM and 104.7 FM. If you guys are digging what Shane and I are putting down, whatever platform you're consuming this content on, give us a like and share that audio and video. Also, make sure you subscribe to whatever that particular service is. If you want to join in on this conversation, you can send us a chat, a tweet, and of course, you can reach us by phone at 202-521-1320. That is 202-521-1320. I have to be honest, over the past weekend, my mind and my thoughts have been captured by what took place the other day. The siege on the Capitol. It's a jarring thing, a weird thing to be in America and see a police station set on fire like was taking place in the Black Lives Matter protests, where even though like 95% were just straightforward protests, an element of it got dangerous and started destroying property, be it CVS or, in this case, especially after Floyd, police stations. That is jarring in a particular way, but that's jarring in a way where you almost feel, at least from my perspective, just. People can disagree with that. You can take shots at me at that. But given what had taken place, considering 1,000 people get killed a year by cops, that felt like a reprisal. The Capitol felt different. It is very true that the Capitol and many of the issues that these guys spend their time with are against the interests of the American public. I mean, for God's sake, 400,000 people, give or take nearly, have dropped dead. 12 million people have been infected. And a lot of this, if not the overwhelming majority of this, can be put at the doorstep of government, be it the inability to act, the focus on the economy as opposed to real human beings. To me, those things demand a certain degree of anger and a certain degree of resentment. Shutting down the business and not ensuring that the business can keep itself afloat while it's being shut down by law is slightly problematic to me, especially from the standpoint of the people who work at that business and the fact that the company probably can't maintain itself. I know the company mostly can't maintain itself because I can look at the stats and see the number of businesses that have basically gone under. I can also see the number of PPP loans and where those loans went, where instead of going to the businesses that needed them, they end up going to the top 1%, including some of Trump's own organizations. I understand the anger that's directed at the Capitol. The difference here is this wasn't anger directed at the Capitol for the things the Capitol was doing wrong, meaning the holding up the $1.8 trillion that Trump was willing to give for, hashtag politics, and accepting $900 million and acting as if the acceptance of half is somehow legit and great when a few weeks earlier Pelosi was losing it on with Blitzer saying how it wasn't. It's very bizarre. The country itself has hit the skids, fallen off of a cliff, and all of the mental and physical energies that all of the people in this particular country dedicate and continue to keep this country going. The social safety net went up in smoke, if it was ever there in the first place. I understand people being angry. I understand people being upset. But the difference and the catch here is that the reason that people attacked the Capitol was based on basically a lie that Donald Trump conjured up. Him and his people not wanting to accept the fact that they lost the race conjures up this lie that the communists is working with the Dominion Capitol, with Hugo Chavez's ghost arm in arm with Nicolas Maduro, working with the Cubans, with the blessings of Xi Jinping from China, and of course, Governor Kim, all conspiring to take Trump out. And all of these people siege the Capitol. Right-wingers, extremists, basic Trump supporters. The argument that many of these people were backwoods and all this other nonsense. Many of these people had companies or businesses. Some of these people basically were cops or part of the military. It is not true to say that the people who are coming here fit into this kind of the deplorable category, quote unquote, that Hillary Clinton would use to describe a large section of America. It's very strange, though. I look at this, and part of me thinks to myself, 4,000 people died that day that they sieged the Capitol. And again, this is with 12 million infected. This is with, like 40% of the businesses going belly up. This is with 12 million people, being affected by the illness, with 400,000 people, give or take, I think it's a little bit less than that, dying. I'm making the point that with the businesses going belly up, with the people being in threat of eviction, with the people being shot by cops with very little response or seeming justice associated with it from the standpoint of law. I'm saying that there is a lot of stuff that is going on right now. But the reason they raided the Capitol was for the weird quirk of Trump and the idea of overturning the presidential election. There's a terror associated with that because that is something that has been used in the past by right-wing groups to overturn governments. I understand people are downplaying this. I even hear some people undermining this, but they should not undermine this. This is an extremely big deal. If Mike Pence and some of the other Republicans decided to go along with this, we have no idea where we would be today. If Trump kept edging them on, we have no idea where we would be today. Interestingly enough, after the fact, as Trump watched this, he was excited by this, but afterwards it hit him on how bad this was. The reality of this, the fact that he could be held for criminal prosecution, especially since he leaves office in 2 weeks. The reality of it, Trump tried to inspire a coup. Trump wanted to be God King. And it is unclear where we would be in this country if this succeeded. What we do know, though, is that there were police officers that were complicit in allowing this. Otherwise, what we saw does not take place. I want to give 2 videos. This is one of the people that basically were having a conversation with the cops. And in this conversation, listen to what they were saying, basically smoking weed in the Capitol. Let's play the clip.
Literally just what happened in there? Tell us what happened.
Yeah, we went in there and then I walked in and there's just a whole bunch of people laying up in some Oregon room. I don't know if it's just tons of Oregon paintings, but they were smoking a bunch of weed in there. And then we moved it down, showing the statues. Cops are very cool. They're like, hey guys, have a good night. And some of them, it's just crazy. It's really weird. You can see that some of them are on our side.
We've reached out to the Capitol Hill police for comment, but have not yet heard back.
That quote, you can see that some of them are on our side. Yeah. If you're out there taking pictures with the cops, and if the cops are waving you in, and if you're able to get into the Capitol itself, one of the most supposedly heavily defended buildings on the face of this earth, ideally, you would think, especially when they are fulfilling the obligations of the Constitution to say or to ensure that Biden becomes president, having a mob attack it is very strange, very bizarre, and questions should be asked on whether or not there were people complicit in regards to this. We found that there were Republican groups that were basically backing these guys and assisting with the money for these guys to do this. Interestingly enough, the zip ties, the pipe bombs that they found, got across that this plan could have been far more severe and could have had far more significant consequences than I think a lot of people are given credit for. What happens if those pipe bombs went off? What happens if these guys would have gotten into the room within the seconds of difference? With the senators? Would they have taken hostages? Would they have been egged on to injure, to kill, to beat? I'm getting the point across that this was dramatically bad. And interestingly enough, like I said, Donald Trump realizes this now. Olivia Nudzi, listen to this. A person who currently advises Trump tells me it's all hit him since yesterday. You may have legal exposure from yesterday. You definitely have legal exposure from other things. You have less than 2 weeks to remain ensconced in here with executive privilege. Donald Trump was annoyed by the violent siege on the Capitol Wednesday, which left several dead, because it looked, quote, low class, unquote. In the end, Trump basically attacks his supporters as low class, despite the fact that he was enamored by what was taking place. As evidence that it seems that Donald Trump realizes that he jumped the shark. Listen to Lindsey Graham. This is one of the funniest and saddest clips. Lindsey Graham degrading himself in order to beg Pelosi to not put up impeachment on Donald Trump. Let's play the clip.
Well, Senator, thank you for being back. Let me go first to this. You and I had, and I don't think you mind, we had a private conversation about the 10-day audit. And you went into a great explanation. You just didn't think it was ever going to come close to working, and that you were even saying then we should move on. Okay, I disagreed with you, but you know, we have agreed on a lot, and sometimes we're going to disagree.
Right.
I don't like what's happening in restaurants and airports to any of these people.
Yeah. Well, number one, I want to thank the police who came to my aid. I know people are frustrated. I wanted President Trump to win so badly. I thought he was a consequential president. I think he made the world safer and more prosperous. I'm a constitutional conservative. I believe in federalism, even when I don't like the outcome. There's a process under our Constitution. I followed it the best I knew how. I stand by my vote. But now tonight, I'm calling on President-elect Biden to pick up the phone and call Nancy Pelosi and the squad to end the second impeachment. President Trump gave a statement last night that was helpful. It hit the mark. He wants to move on to a peaceful transfer of power. He wants this to end. I've been with him most of the day. He's going to focus on his agenda, his successes for the American people in the next few days. But Joe Biden said it's up to Congress regarding impeachment. No, President-elect Biden, it's up to you. Pick up the phone, call Nancy Pelosi, Chuck Schumer, and the squad and tell them, stand down. This will destroy the country even further. You have the power to do that. The question is, do you have the courage to do it?
Somebody's scared. Somebody is scared. Lindsey Graham doesn't make this hostage video if he is not concerned. He is not making this video if he believes that the Republican Party wouldn't vote for this, which means that there's a potential that there are Republicans out there that would vote to impeach Trump on this issue. The shining city on a hill being besieged or being sieged by basically Republicans. Yeah, that's not going to go over well. Here's my question. And I think this is the real question that I think lefties watching this should ask. If all of this, everything that you've seen, went down the exact same way with one difference, lefties and right-wingers were angry, sieged the Capitol because 400,000 people died. Because all of these businesses, 40%, went belly up because the government basically shut them down. That all of these people who are infected with this illness that have let's say, conditions and symptoms that extend beyond the illness itself, the medical bills that those people have, the eviction notices that those people have. If those people were arm in arm with, let's say, the Proud Boys, taking a dump in Pelosi and McConnell's desk, arm in arm, side by side, on a microphone, together, doing this for America, would it be justified? That's the question. I think, honestly, is it an issue of environment where the reason that people are angry is because it's such a stupid reason, this treasonous idea of keeping Trump in office? But what if it was a good reason? Shane, what if it wasn't for Trump? What if it was for America itself? What are your thoughts?
Got like 30 seconds to respond here, so I'll try. I'll put it like this. I think that a revolutionary movement is proportional not just to its ability to effectively protest, but to its ability to organize some new status quo on the other side of a successful revolution. And for that reason, I think, if you look at the structure of most successful revolutionary organizations, and I want to be clear, I'm not saying I support a violent overthrow of the United States, very, very much not saying that. In fact, the opposite. If you look at most of them, they have like a long institutional history. And right now, people are so divided against each other that I do not see a cross-partisan political movement coming together and successfully building up an institution unless people do a lot of work internally and externally to work together, to understand each other, to organize online and offline, and to come to some sort of new bridging of these like hemispherically separated wholes of the American body politic. Does that make sense before we go into our break tomorrow?
Yeah, that does make sense. And you can give a full throat at 8:15. We have a blank segment there. But yeah, I understand where you're going. It's basically we're so divided that the idea that we're going to come together for something like this is almost off the table. We can't even have this conversation on who won, right? We can't even decide on that.
Absolutely. And really specifically, just right before we go, not just come together, but come together in a lasting sense where you can build up something that will work on the other side of your proposed serious rejection of the United States. We need to go into a break. We'll have more time for conversation in about 45 minutes. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We'll be right back.
Fault Lines.
You're listening to Radio Sputnik.
Epidemics and pandemics could kill millions of people, and they actually did. Centuries ago, deadly outbreaks called the Black Death The plague of Justinian and the Spanish flu ravaged countries, empires, and whole continents. Some of these diseases are still present around the globe. Others have become a thing of the past. Discover how these ancient and not so distant outbreaks from previous centuries differ from modern-day SARS, MERS, and coronavirus pandemics. Listen to our new series, Outbreak, the deadliest epidemics in human history. This week on Radio Sputnik.
Fault Lines.
And we are back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan, and we are joined by our guest, Dr. Piers Robinson. He is a political scientist and the co-director of the Organization for Propaganda Studies. Piers, thank you for joining us. How are you doing this morning?
I'm doing well, thank you.
Thank you. Or should I say this afternoon? I believe you're located in the UK, right?
Well, I'm actually in Germany, and we're just into the afternoon here, but I'm happy to be on your time.
There you go, and we're happy to have you. All right, let's start off, I suppose, with the OPCW and one more recent show, and then a slightly older one, which puts that into some context. A little bit over a week ago, the Gray Zone reports that OPCW's chief dodged questions ineffectively at first when he was asked about the OPCW's coverage of a supposed chemical weapons attack, a apparent false flag from a lot of the coverage that we've done, I'll be honest. Dodging questions about this, not answering them after, of course, the OPCW had written up reports that blamed it in a sort of a classic establishment take on the Assad government. Now, just a month earlier, OPCW executives, in another release by the Gray Zone, this one an exclusive, OPCW executives had criticized the manipulation of that probe, basically saying that although they had some qualms about how that probe was handled, that they nevertheless feared helping the quote-unquote Russian narrative, end quote. So when you put those two releases, when you put those two sort of sets of statements, one public, one private, together, it seems that there are internally some qualms at the OPCW about how this whole thing was handled, but they faced serious political pressure from the outside. First of all, Piers, am I right in that analysis? What's your take on both of these sets of events?
Yeah, I mean, this is correct. I mean, the OPCW issue ever since the alleged attack in Duma in 2018 has revolved around the accuracy and the autonomy of the investigation. And of course, there have been people who had direct knowledge of the investigation speaking out. And this has been going on for 2 years now. And the recent leaks that you referred to, which were published in a Gray Zone, you see evidence of wider concerns within the OPCW as to what was going on. And actually a rationale which is put forward from one senior OPCW official is that they couldn't really get into the issue of what had gone wrong with the investigation for fear of playing into the Russian narrative as it's described. And what it all goes to show is that, you do have an organization with the OPCW where there are clearly a significant number of people who are raising very serious questions about the accuracy of their investigation, the alleged chemical weapons attack. And in a very important way, there is great difficulty in those voices being properly heard. The OPCW has done for a long time, continued to block questions, refuse to answer, and really, point blank. I mean, Bastani, for example, was blocked. He's the first Director General of the OPCW, and he was blocked from talking at the UN Security Council in September. And as you suggested, the current Director General was questioned at the UN Security Council meeting on December the 11th, but apparently he answered in private, or not in private, but in closed session afterwards. So the OPCW simply isn't responding to the questions being asked. America and the UK are backing the OPCW, and we are really still in a position where there is very serious questions about the investigation that was carried out by the OPCW. They're not being answered, and the issue isn't going away. And I think this will just go on and on until finally somebody within the OPCW decides it's time to put their house in order on this issue.
Dr. Robinson, welcome to the show. I think it goes beyond the questions aren't being answered. I don't even think the questions are, if I'm being honest, being asked. I mean, if you think of the way media has covered this particular story, I'm always enamored by sometimes reality, the way it peaks out. Meaning, if mainstream media doesn't pay attention to this, I always ask, are they lying or are they complicit? How do you ignore a story that it seems like an organization that is only supposed to be there to give a determination of, yes, this country did this, or no, this country did not do that. The politics doesn't necessarily supposed to fly. It's supposed to be like a lab test, yay or nay. That this place is ensconced in politics. And the media itself basically gives it a blind eye. What does it mean about our media when something like this happens? I mean, I think this is a major deal. They use this as a justification for an attack on another country, an attack that, if I'm not mistaken, killed people. And there's a question on whether or not the president of the United States should be issuing attacks like this in and of itself, regardless of what the report said. But the fact that this was used as a basis of an attack on a country, that seems like it would take on more significance in regards to the discrepancy of the whistleblowers versus the report itself, or the report that was given. And yet, oddly enough, strangely enough, mainstream media doesn't seem to be all that concerned about this. Explain that for me. What is it? Are they complicit or are they oblivious? Which one is it?
Well, it's a very well understood analysis of mainstream media, even in democracies, which you'll find across the political communication literature going back decades. And I think Noam Chomsky and Edward Herman's famous propaganda model is perhaps the most popular variation of this analysis. But it is that the mainstream media has been, for a long time, very, very closely located to political and economic power, and that for a variety of reasons severely constrains its ability to be properly independent of that political and economic power. Those dynamics, they are stronger, I'm sure, than they've ever been in the history of Western liberal democracies. The mainstream media engages in self-censorship, but it also engages, as you're suggesting, in some instances, in a degree of complicity with going along with the line that's being pushed by a government. And this happens particularly in wartime, and particularly in relation to foreign policy. This has always been the case, and it's more intense now. And this is the problem you have with the OPCW issue, and of course it's in relation to the war in Syria, is that positions which deviate from the government line, positions which challenge or dissent from the government line, are very difficult to articulate. You're attacked, you're smeared, journalists can threaten to have their contacts cut off, and so on. And you also have sort of straightforward patriotism tending to play a role in shaping how journalists act and behave. But all of these factors combined to mean that the media, or certainly the mainstream media, doesn't really do its job of asking difficult questions. So when you have a scandal like this, they avoid it. Sometimes these scandals come to light. I mean, the Iraq WMD scandal sort of surfaced, although after the invasion of that country back in 2003. There was, of course, the Vietnam War, and a degree of controversy emerged in the US media at a certain point in the late 60s and during the 70s in relation to that war. So occasionally the media does start to take on a more independent, challenging line, but most of the time it doesn't. It falls into line with the positions of their governments. And you see this very clearly here. The OPCW, in the context of the war in Syria, the French and the British and the Americans have been part of a regime change policy in that conflict for 10 years now. And the narrative of chemical weapons attacks being blamed on the Syrian government forms part of the narrative that they're pushing. And if you want to question that, or if there's been deception, which appears to be the case here in relation to that, it's a difficult path for mainstream journalists to tread without getting a lot of attacks and flack. And the same goes for academics as well. So I think that's the long answer to your question. A short answer to your question is, the political communication literature tells us why media is not as independent as we claim it to be. And that's the reason why you see what you see in the case of the OPCW. It's an issue which is inconsistent with the interests and the perspectives of the government positions, and raising the issue makes life difficult for journalists and so on, and that curtails how they cover the issue. And I think that's at the heart of it.
And in an interesting way, what the gray zone has done has usefully pierced the veil. It's lifted the veil on what's going on inside the OPCW and showing sort of compare and contrast with what they're doing externally, the statements they're making and the statements they're not willing to make publicly. I'm curious, with the recent events this weekend over here in the United States, but I'm sure they're being felt around the world, Parler, the social media app, being taken down, Trump getting banned permanently from Twitter, those might be seen as one-off political events, but I don't think anybody sees them that way. I think everybody's sort of preparing for some upcoming wave, a longer-term process by which more and more of the digital commons are appropriated by certain elites to, grow their own political interests at home. Another way of looking at this, I want to get your take on, if the journalistic organ for a long time had this problem, and I don't think we occasionally mention it, but the CIA Project Mockingbird to infiltrate and very much steer what media outlets are willing to cover. If that journalistic organ has a problem, and that problem has, over the last couple of decades at least, metastasized through more and more other spheres of life and to other institutions, and if it's increasingly metastasizing to the public at large through what we're willing to say, what we're able to say, what we're willing to say online, either out of our own knowledge or out of a fear of getting banned, that kind of thing. If it's increasingly covering what we're able to say, where does this go? Is there any corrective that you can see for this before we go into our break here in a couple of minutes, Piers?
Well, it's a very important point that you're raising here. I mean, it's extremely worrying what is happening throughout the West. As you say, there's been the focus on Parler and Trump and what's been happening over the weekend in the US. But there is a wider culture of closing down dissent, deplatforming. You're now seeing a very real manifestation of that with, a concerted attempt to remove platforms from operating, as well as shoring up this kind of culture we have where if anyone, people who raise questions, difficult questions, whether it's about war or whether it's about, lockdowns in response to COVID-19, you're simply attacked and you're deplatformed. And this applies to scientists as well. And from a basic liberal democratic point of view, this is extremely worrying. The only way that democracies and liberal democracies can survive is through free speech, allowing people to express dissenting opinions and to argue and debate with each other. And we seem to be moving very far away from that. And I think for the future, we should all be extremely concerned about where this is taking us. This can take us into a post-democratic phase at the speed it's going at, to this kind of strategies of censorship and smearing, people asking questions. This is extremely worrying, and I'm very worried for the future. And I think for people who are committed to free speech, we need to really double down on our efforts to make clear that it's important that people are allowed to voice opinions. It is important to allow civilized debate to occur, because if we lose that, then we lose democracy, and that is an extremely worrying situation, obviously.
Well, and Piers, we have to go into a break. I think I might disagree slightly. I don't know that we'll lose democracy. I think it might be simply a transition from the earlier phrase that used liberal democracy to something like an autocratic democracy or so. And I don't mean to mince words or speak too simply about this, but you can still have majority rule. But if that majority rule is used as the surface of a cudgel wielded by the establishment through propaganda, then you can still get the large groups of people voting on things. But if they're not making informed votes, they're not able to talk about the votes that they're making, if they're not able to talk about the substance of who they're voting for, as in the case of the Hunter Biden story, that, of course, was widely suppressed late 2020. Anyway, we need to go to a break. We'll be back in just a minute. We are joined, by the way, by Dr. Piers Robinson. He is a political scientist and the co-director of the Organization for Propaganda Studies. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We'll be right back.
Fault Lines.
Feeling kind of blue, but maybe also kind of red, and kind of purple, and kind of alone? You've got a friend on Radio Sputnik. Tune into Political Misfits from 12 to 2 Eastern Time, Monday through Friday, for news, politics, and culture without the two-party bias. Catch us daily on 105.5 in Washington, D.C., or 102.9 or 104.7 in Kansas City. Or find us on Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, Spotify, or wherever you get your news.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined by my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in Washington, D.C. Joining us is Dr. Piers Robinson, political scientist and co-director of the Organization for Propaganda Studies. Dr. Robinson, one of the wild parts, to me, and the way I look at politics, I look at media and politics as being these kind of intermeshed aspects of each other. As opposed to media holding politicians accountable, oftentimes you have, let's say, backroom deals like Ken Delanian, who basically had his stories read by the CIA, was fired from the Los Angeles Times, but ends up getting another job in reporting. And I think this happens more often than I think people realize it in the way that information is relayed to the public. And it's relayed to the public in a way that has a certain bias associated with the class that's dispensing the information. Let's say, for example, the mainstream media. They chose. Shane, when he was going out, made the point about the Hunter Biden story in the way that they did not want that story aired, but they would air pretty much everything on Trump. I mean, social media had got to the point where they would argue that, well, we don't want to air things that were leaked. And they said this with a straight face, despite the fact for the last 3 years, all of the leaked data that would come out on Trump just came out. There was no issue. Now, I am not a fan of Trump. And anybody who knows me, I deride him ferociously. But in this very specific situation, it doesn't seem that media was a passive actor. It seemed that media it made a choice in regards to who it wanted, whether that was in the primaries of the Democratic primaries or whether that was in this election. The most brazen of ways was basically the Hunter Biden story. What do you think about this notion of media as a class that has its own certain point of view, that point of view gets intermeshed with the public's point of view, where the public's point of view almost doesn't exist? It's only the media's and that class. What is your thoughts on that?
Well, I think it's certainly the case that, and this goes back to the point made earlier about the proximity of mainstream media, the big corporations, to political and economic power, is that you have, a grouping of people who tend to share the same outlook on the world. And so some analysts put this in terms of, well, when people go into these big organizations, that people who fit, people who have the right way of thinking, in inverted commas, tend to get promoted more rapidly and tend to reach the top of those organizations and become sort of the big name journalists. And they do. And I think it's fairly clear they do form a particular class. I think in the US context, but also in the European context, you have the political class. It's fairly narrowly defined in terms of ideological outlook and so on. And journalists are part of that same, they move in the same circles and so on. And that creates, I think, effectively a kind of a bubble and also a unity between politicians and the mainstream media. A lot of them will socialize together. They are good friends, etc. And what that ultimately means is that, it's very difficult for journalists to then, whilst they're so close to political power, it's very difficult for them to actually properly hold it to account. And I think it was an American journalist that made this comment about sort of it's very difficult if you're playing golf with a politician at the weekend, and then during the week you're meant to be sort of holding to account and asking difficult questions. It doesn't really work like that. You don't do that. And I think that that term class or that grouping, that's exactly what you have, and that's one of the big problems problems that you have is that they do represent a particular outlook, a particular point of view. And this is run through the kind of crisis that we've had throughout many Western countries over the last 10, 20 years, this kind of sort of rise of populism and people becoming dissatisfied with governments, is that sense that you have a clear, as almost a class division between the people in power, the journalists who are, as it were, closely located to them, and the rest of us. And this is, this is damaging with democracy, and it is I think is the reality of it. I mean, there was a Leveson inquiry in the UK a number of years back following phone tapping scandal in British newspapers, and what came out of the Leveson inquiry was this extraordinarily close relationship between the big media, the journalists, Murdoch's organisations, and British prime ministers and politicians, and when that sort of came out, it became very, very clear that sort of these people are part of a particular club, and that's not how democracy is not meant to work. That's not really how the media is meant to be positioned. Journalists are supposed to be there to ask difficult, challenging questions, not to be sharing the same worldview as politicians, but to be challenging what's being said. And that's one of the big problems that we have, and one of the reasons I guess why so many people do go to alternative and mainstream media today, because they do see that inherent bias. And so on. And I think that's clearer today. I'm not sure what your views on this is, but I'm sure this is clearer today than it's ever been in certainly recent history, the last 20, 30, 40 years.
I agreed on that. Yeah, completely. I mean, and part of the problem here seems to be, especially literally right now in the last year, but more this weekend than ever, I think, while access to alternative sources of information with the internet seems to have risen, your actual ability to get into them right now seems to be at a critical sort of point of negative inflection, where simply being able to access that information. In other words, with the banning of Parler, what's being set up there is not just the banning of a specific social media platform on grounds that platform would be used to call for violence, but the banning of a platform in general for not just political reasons, but for, you can make, in other words, you can make an argument for domestic security, not just by banning forms of speech that might allow for insurrection or for violent acts at home, but for forms of speech that simply oppose the interest of the American empire as a whole. If you can make the case that the Off Guardian or that other news outlets that are covering, I'm just bringing them up because I see you have a recent article there, but those outlets are covering our wars overseas, our proxy wars or our direct wars, in a way that will, for instance, threaten the lives of American soldiers. That might seem like a slightly far-fetched case on the one hand, but on the other hand, it's clear as day that could be made. And if you can use that to suppress those platforms, to shut those platforms down, I'm worried that will be coming fairly soon, especially as we're in a sort of revisionary mode, looking at how we're managing and monitoring the social media giants and in general the internet. It seems like during Biden's first administration, potentially a second administration, a Democratic second administration, whatever form that holds. Are you worried about that in the next 4 to 8 years, Piers, not just nationally in the United States, but internationally suppressing websites on all ends of the political spectrum based on what they're covering, what they're choosing to cover?
Yeah, I'm extremely worried about that. I mean, you see the first signs of it with this kind of talk of a new war on terror, a war on domestic terrorism in the US. And that seems to be becoming a very real possibility that new policies will be put in place. And just as you described, you can see this kind of, shifting the goalposts so that sort of speech which is harmful is not simply sort of incitement to violence, which has always been sort of unacceptable, but it will include people who are questioning, dissenting, this notion of harming people because you have an opinion which is different from them, which seems to be an idea circulating through a lot of Western culture at the moment. And as you say, you will always, people in power will always be able to develop rationales or ways of arguing, well, that is dangerous speech, that is, for example, the term conspiracy theory is always used to close down people questioning power kind of thing. That was used with Iran-Contra until it became accepted as fact. But all of these methods mechanisms, all these tools being used to basically criminalize dissent. And I think we're heading in that direction, yes. One sort of one caveat on that is that they will seek to control, I guess, the internet and seek to try and reduce levels of dissent if they can achieve that on the internet. But it won't make that go away, ultimately, that people talk face to face, people communicate and so on in social settings. And that's just as important in some ways as what they're doing on the internet or what they're doing in terms of watching mainstream media. So there might be this belief that minds can be controlled in this way, but I'm not convinced that they will ultimately be successful. I imagine that there will be resistance to this, and I imagine that resistance will grow. The more censorship you have, the more forceful governments become, the more people will fight against that. I'm not saying it's an even fight, obviously, and I'm not saying it's not a fight that won't take some time, but I think people will inherently, instinctively, especially in the West, where there's a culture of freedom, etc., and freedom of expression, people will push back against that. And you'll find new forms. I mean, I would not be surprised if there is much more in the way of actual traditional print newspapers, people distributing leaflets, for example, starting. I've already seen signs of that in one or two European countries. And there might well be a return to that mode of communication, which I think is not a bad one at all. It's all well and good doing things online, but you can also do things locally, and you can print and you can produce and so on. People will find ways of communicating. But it's going to be, for sure, we're in for a very rough ride. For advocates of free speech, we're in for a very rough ride in the coming months and years, I believe.
Let me ask you this. So what should be done then? I mean, because there's Twitter, Facebook, Google, all of these things are just private companies. And I've made issues myself talking about this notion of a commons and how that commons has been utterly destroyed, or for that matter, privatized. And the moment that the commons become privatized, well, at that point you have tech CEOs who basically make the determination on who speaks and who doesn't. In 30 seconds, should the internet become a public utility? What should be done in regards to, let's say, laws to try to protect freedom of speech in this regard?
Well, I'm not sure about making the internet a public utility, but I think laws which protect basic freedom of speech and democratic rights, those are the things that we need to be reinforcing at this point in time. You know, and of course we have all the terrible COVID-19 lockdown, all the debates surrounding that and so on, all the damage that that's doing to freedom of assembly, etc., etc. But what you need is you just need to have a fierce commitment to democracy and to the laws which protect free speech. And in many ways, we should be demanding our politicians to protect that in the name of democracy and ultimately social stability as well.
Dr. Piers, Dr. Robinson, we have to stop it here, but I really do appreciate you coming on, having this conversation. Dr. Piers Robinson is a political scientist and co-director of the Organization for Propaganda Studies. You can follow Dr. Robinson on Twitter at PiersRobinson1 and his blog, piersrobinson.wordpress.com. This is Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We will be back in a moment.
Listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Fault Lines.
Live from the divided states of America, welcome to your daily inoculation for propaganda. In the left corner, I am the indefatigable, the ever vigilant, the last antibody to a sick and seasoned political system. Your political analyst, Jamarl Thomas.
And in the independent corner, I am your political analyst, Shane Stranahan.
That means, more likely than not, you are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan.
That's like a Schrodinger's listener there you have, Jamarl. Like, if they're not listening to us, then they wouldn't hear you saying those words. If they are listening to us, then by definition, they do hear you saying those words. And unless they're living inside, they could be living in a weird parallel universe where they hear you say those words and somehow they're still not listening to the show. I just don't see how that works.
Right. Well, I guess in my head, I was thinking of the
joke.
parallel universe thing. But to be honest, even if they were listening to the show in the parallel universe, they're still listening to the show, even if it's with Jamarl Thomas and, Bob Newland, whoever that is, or Shane Stranahan and Tom. It's still technically fault lines. So yeah. Let's get to the headlines. I love those type of if you're in an alternate universe, listen in the fault lines.
You know what? Oh man. No.
Go ahead.
No. If you're in it, if Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan falls in a forest and nobody hears it, is it really a radio show or is it just a dual soliloquy?
Listen, does it exist if somebody? Well, the thing is, yes, it exists because those are people still doing the show. Whereas the tree is an inanimate object. If nobody hears it, does it actually hit the ground? We, at the very least, are still there doing the news. But let's get to the headlines. In the news, at least 1,777 new coronavirus deaths and 208,338 new cases were reported in the United States on January 10th. Over the past week, there's been an average of 254,866 cases per day, an increase of 38% from an average 2 weeks earlier, and almost 375,000 people have died. Keep in mind, when you're coming in off the weekend, for whatever reason, that number is always lower. And I suspect that's a reporting issue, not necessarily an issue of less death. I could be wrong. Tomorrow is probably going to be higher. New York City opened 2 massive COVID-19 vaccination hubs Sunday. The site will be operating 24/7 until everyone in New York City is vaccinated. Doctors, nurses, COVID-19 testing and inoculation staffers, and nursing home employees and residents have already gotten the green light for vaccination. Today, school employees, including teachers, first responders, such as police and firefighters, and public transit workers are allowed to begin getting vaccinations. As of Saturday, overnight, fewer than half of the vaccines that the city has received has been doled out, or 203,181 out of the 524,425. Of those 203,000, about 185,000 were their first dose. Johnson & Johnson is expected to deliver preliminary late-stage trial results for its one-dose COVID vaccine candidate by the end of January. If the quote-unquote jab is proven to be safe and effective, the company aims to deliver at least 1 billion doses by the end of the year. House lawmakers may have been exposed to someone testing positive for COVID-19 while they were sheltered at an undisclosed location during the Capitol siege by a violent mob loyal to President Donald Trump. The Capitol's attending physician notified all lawmakers Sunday of the virus exposure and urged them to be tested. The infected individual was not named. Now, this is a big deal, and this is one of the other unstated stories, in addition to the pipe bombs that the media hasn't talked about hugely, and the guy with the zip ties, and apparently the plans to maybe take some of these guys hostage. Apparently, when the Congress members were huddled into this kind of room, the safe room, somebody there had COVID. Many of the Republicans were not wearing masks and were laughing at the person who was trying to hand out the mask. Meaning that the room with the Congress members and people were basically infected because some of the people there had the mindset, oh, I don't want to wear a mask. And apparently somebody there also had COVID. It means everybody in that room was exposed to COVID-19 and will probably have to start quarantining sooner rather than later. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi announced the House will be moving forward with a resolution to impeach President Donald Trump, referring to the president in a letter to colleagues as an imminent threat, quote unquote, to the United States Constitution and democracy. On Monday, House leaders will work to swiftly pass legislation to do that. If it is blocked by Republicans, the House will convene for a full House vote on Tuesday. Pelosi explained that the resolution calls on Vice President Mike Pence to, quote, to convene and mobilize the cabinet to activate the 25th Amendment to declare President Donald Trump incapable of executing the duties of his office. unquote. Under the procedure, the vice president, quote, would immediately exercise power as acting president, unquote. Trump is due to leave office on January 20th. Basically, Pelosi is saying either you use the 25th Amendment to take him out of that office or we are going to impeach him. Again, the clip that I played with Lindsey Graham basically begging in a hostage video scenario, Joe Biden to corral Nancy Pelosi and to stop her from pushing through the 25th Amendment. Mitch McConnell, this is not part of it, but this is one of the things I was covering the other day. Mitch McConnell basically has drawn the line in the sand. His point is, fine, if you want to do with impeachment, we'll deal with impeachment, but after we get back, which means that the impeachment will be dealt with during Joe Biden's first 100 days. Now, this is assuming that Democrats don't deal with it after the first 100 days, since at this point, Chuck Schumer is going to be controlling is going to be majority leader. But what this boils down to is Mitch McConnell basically drawing the line in the sand saying, yeah, I am not taking this up before we come back. And when we come back, it is going to be in Biden's first 100 days. Feel free to do the impeachment then. So it's unclear what's going to happen here. Nancy Pelosi could be serious and could try to go for it. Apparently, there are a few Republicans that are on board for the impeachment. Whether or not they would care as much after the fact, it's unclear. But they could go through with it with the idea of barring Trump from ever getting into office again. And whether or not they will be massively divisive or not, I am not sure. Beforehand, I would say yes. But now, I don't know. I think this attack on the Capitol has burned a lot of bridges from the standpoint of people that might have been okay with Donald Trump. And all of those no votes that might have been there for the impeachment before, some of those votes might have turned to yes. And I suspect that's why Lindsey Graham was on that video begging Joe Biden to get Pelosi to not file these impeachment articles. Very interesting. 2 Capitol Hill police officers are now dead as a result of the Capitol siege. Brian Sicknick, who suffered injuries during the riot on Wednesday and succumbed to those injuries following day on Thursday. And now Howard Lebengood, who committed suicide on Saturday. Lebengood was a 15-year veteran who responded to Capitol riot in the halls of Congress. The U.S. Capitol Police are not directly linking Lebengood's death on Wednesday riots as he was off duty when he killed himself. The 2022 PGA Championship, which has been scheduled since 2014 to be played at Trump National in Bedminster, will not take place there in the wake of the outbreak of violence in the Capitol. The PGA of America, the governing body for the major championship, on Sunday voted to move the event from the New Jersey golf course because of its ties with Donald Trump. Wow, very interesting. Parler, a social media app popular with conservatives and supporters of President Donald Trump, has gone offline after Amazon withdrew its support in the wake of the deadly U.S. Capitol riot. The app was reliant on cloud computing power provided by Amazon Web Services. AWS told Parler on Saturday that it would no longer provide cloud services to the company beginning on Sunday at 11:59 Pacific Time. John Matz, founder and CEO, said in a statement on Monday that the Parler app will be down, quote, longer than expected, unquote, because other cloud hosting companies do not want to work with Parler in light of the press statements issued by Amazon, Google, and Apple. Apple removed Parler from the iPhone App Store on Saturday. The company said that posts on Parler related to the U.S. Capitol riot included calls for violence, which violates Apple's rules against objectionable content. You know, what's interesting on that also, there's been additional, let's say it that way, posts of people who basically want to have another, let's say, siege on the Capitol. I've made the point that the siege on the Capitol was massively successful, that anybody who's looking at this, who might be alienated from our current government, is looking at this as a success. All of the consternation, all of the complaining, all of the, let's say, locks on Parler, all of those things are positive, let's say, pushbacks from the state on these groups. But understand, the right-wing militias, the groups that were doing this, they may feel emboldened by all of this. The fact that you could siege the Capitol of the United States, where you could have a Confederate flag roaming the halls of the Capitol, and the people who are there know as a flat fact that they actually have people who are complicit and willing to help them in their cause. People who are cops and people who are part of the military. I think that was a massive success. And I think that success will beget other actions. I could be wrong, but we'll see. I think what we just saw with the Capitol being sieged in the future is going to be looked at as a demarcation point, or it's going to be looked at one of those canary in the coal mine moments when things change, whatever that change means. On Friday, Twitter permanently banned Trump from social media platforms, citing the risk that he will incite further violence. Adamant supporter of Trump, radio host Rush Limbaugh, then deactivated his own Twitter account. Trump's personal attorney, Rudy Giuliani, appeared on Steve Bannon's YouTube podcast, War Room. He placed blame on the Democratic Party for Wednesday's Capitol siege, arguing that it was orchestrated to make Trump look bad. That's great. A few hours, YouTube removed the episode and banned Steve Bannon's podcast or pod channel, The War Room, all together. Shane, what do you think about that? I mean, they basically went through blacklisting various groups, be it Bannon, be it, I don't know, a lot of people have been complaining about followers just vanishing. And I suppose those were the various accounts on Twitter that were basically being eliminated. Without going into the other accounts, just dealing with Trump for the moment. What are your thoughts on the President of the United States being banned on his, I guess, the platform that he wielded the most insults and the most policy? I mean, Trump used to get on Twitter and basically give policy announcements to other people across the globe and across the country. And at the very least with Twitter, you got the idea of what was going on in Trump's head. So what do you think about the eliminating Trump from Twitter? And do you believe that Trump was inciting a violent mob to assault the White House using his Twitter account? What are your thoughts?
Using his Twitter account in part, yeah, although I think the what he actually said the day of was worse. I don't like it at all. Yeah, I mean, I feel like we've already covered this a bit. We've already talked about this. I like them booting Parler off slightly less, but it's really Apple, like two different varieties of apples. It's not apples and oranges. They're both bad. And another way to look at this, here's one more angle, and then I want to throw in another sort of sub-headline before you move on. Another way to look at this is that internationally, I think many people in other countries and the governments of other countries themselves have good reason to be worried about getting cracked down on for whatever reason, for whatever cause, by Twitter. Now that Twitter has removed the account of that country's own president, of the United States' own president. Now, admittedly, this is following everything that happened. This is following the March on Washington and the insurrection in the Capitol.
Yeah,
it's come up with some name for what happened.
Fair game. That's what that means. If Twitter is
that's exactly
willing
what
to get
that
rid
means.
of the president of the United States, every other country is lesser by definition, which means they're 100%. Fair game.
And that's exactly where I'm going with this. And so, what I was calling digital nationalism is just going to increase the propensity for individual countries or individual blocks of countries to create their own platforms, create their own internet infrastructure. In an interesting, here is a brief little irony here. The internet was supposed to and successfully did tie so much of the globe together. There's this information globalization process. And yet, as far as I can tell, it will probably be one of the first significant institutions to undergo the most dramatic reversal in the opposite direction, where different countries and different blocks of countries have their own internets for all intents and purposes. Now, one brief subheadline here: it wasn't just Twitter that got blocked, it wasn't just Parler that got banned, it wasn't just a bunch of different individuals. Sci-Hub, are you familiar with Sci-Hub, Jamarl?
No, I don't know what that one is. What's that?
So Sci-Hub is a website hosted, I believe, by a woman in like Kyrgyzstan, something like that has gotten very popular. If you look into it, you'll see what I'm saying. Has a big Wikipedia article. Plenty of scientists, academics know about it. Basically, it takes journal articles. It takes articles like paywalled articles that you would have to pay dozens or hundreds of dollars to access in the sciences and various branches of the sciences, and posts them online for free. That account also got banned for some reason. Didn't look too deep into it, but it was on the same day. It was on Friday, same day as Trump got banned. And in my opinion, that's also hugely significant. If you will look around, you will see a bunch of people lamenting the banning of Sci-Hub from Twitter. So it's not just Trump. Again, it might just be a coincidence that it happened on the same day. But as far as I can tell, Sci-Hub still exists as a website, of course. They move their domain pretty frequently. Is like an unmitigated good. It is a very good thing to increase people's access to information that frankly should be free or at the very least too cheap to meter. So just throwing that into the pot too.
Whoa, Shane. But those places, it's knowledge. I mean, they're charging for the knowledge that they've gleaned. I mean, you don't think that knowledge should be behind a paywall, Shane?
Well, here's the thing. Stuart Brand, so sort of main member of Good Earth News Network and one of the founding members, I think, of Wired. Anyway, maybe that last part's not true. Anyway, he had this good quote, which is, I'm going to paraphrase it slightly. Information should be free because it is so valuable, and yet information should also be incredibly expensive because it is so valuable. In other words, it should be free because it's so cheap to share, and yet there's a positive sum thing where you share information with people, assuming, of course, the information is useful to them. But of course, it's also so valuable, so you want to charge money for it. That's the inherent contradiction of the internet, frankly, but also of information as a whole, and that comes to play directly on this issue. But yeah, I'm unabashedly in favor of Sci-Hub. Anyway.
Same here. Yeah, my bias is for the information to be shared. I think it's a public good. So yeah, I agree. Those are your headlines. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Let's do this. Let's come back. We have an open segment. We'll be taking your calls, 202-521-1320. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Be back in a moment.
Fault Lines. Want to talk? Get in touch with us at radio@sputniknews.com. By Any Means Necessary is your guide to the movement and efforts shaping the world around us, from mass incarceration.
No longer am I interested in or concerned with prison reform. I am interested only in the eradication of prisons.
To the battle between police and water protectors.
It was a pretty punishing disregard for the sanctity of human life, that unleashing water cannons on peaceful, prayerful water protectors.
From efforts to protect the environment.
The climate movement is ready to, with plenty of opposition research and force and strength, along with, the right of both science and morality, to fight them on this.
To the movement for Black Lives.
When I first saw the Michael Brown video, when I saw that it clearly contradicted the narrative put forth by the Ferguson Police Department and by police supporters in general, 3 words came to mind. Color me shocked.
Stay tuned to By Any Means Necessary, 5 days a week here on Radio Sputnik. Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined by my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in Washington, D.C. If you guys live in the area, you can catch us on radio at 105.5 FM at 1390 AM. We're also in Kansas City at 102.9 FM and 104.7 FM. If you guys are digging what Shane and I are putting down, whatever platform you're consuming this content on, give us a like and share that audio or video. If you want to join in on the conversation, you can send us a chat, a tweet, and of course, you can reach us by phone at 202-521-1320. That is 202-521-1320. Shane, I wanted to come back to the question that was asked prior. This notion of, how I feel about the assault on the Capitol. I am horrified by it. And I think, like I said, this is a canary in the coal mine, and not just a canary in the coal mine. The sovereignty of the U.S. government was basically challenged by right-wing militia groups and people who were there, organized for the exact purpose of stopping Joe Biden from basically being, or let's say stopping the constitutional functions from allowing or pushing Joe Biden to be president of the United States, an election that he seemingly won and that Trump seemingly lost. My question in the beginning that I kind of want you to answer, because I know it's not an easy one to answer. If all of those people were there for healthcare, this is a sandbox world that I'm posing, not the it's impossible or not this can't happen. No. The man's question. like think it like a man. If those people showed up there. Everything happened same way. People walked, maybe not the same way, not the Confederate flag. Let's say it's a medical flag instead of a Confederate flag. But people walking through the Capitol and all this other stuff, the cops giving them an end. Let's say some of those cops have family members that died or businesses that were shut down. Some of the military personnel that was there had family members that maybe have passed. And let's say that their issue was nearly 400,000 people have died. We have, 40% of retail went up in smoke. You have companies from the standpoint of healthcare, like Walmart and Jeff Bezos, getting nearly $1 trillion extra. You have 20-something million people infected, and trying to get Medicare for all, even for a vote, even Medicare for everybody with COVID, seems off the table entirely. If this was for that, would that have justified the act? I'm enamored by that question. What do you think, Shane?
Yes. But I think it would have been dramatically better than what happened here for a couple of reasons. For one thing, that might have been a significant step towards bridging the gap, like we were talking about earlier, between the left and the right. For another thing, the pushback on it wouldn't have been nearly so one-sided. So the establishment as a whole would have pushed back, but it would have been marginal, and there would be plenty of people in Congress who would be harboring at least hidden feelings of commiseration with the movement that did that. But yes, I think that would have been justified. Would it have produced a sort of net positive in comparison to nothing happening? I don't know. Would it have been better or worse for that to happen than this one? Yes. Would it have been good for that to happen? I don't know. Would it have been justified? Yes.
Those are fascinating questions, aren't they? And none of them have been asked by media. Media hasn't touched this question. And it seems to be the question that matters the most. If the American public gets very angry because the American public feels that Congress have basically left them in the lurch, that the government, for the most part, that had the responsibility of ensuring that the social safety net was sound, didn't do that. If the public responded, I agree with you. I think it makes it right. I think the question, or at the very least, I think it justifies it. Whether it would be a net positive, I don't know. My feeling is yes. I guess my feeling is, because right now, I agree with Dorr on this notion that politicians on some level need to be made uncomfortable. I don't agree that they need to be made uncomfortable by trying to overturn the election result for Donald Trump. It's like, why is it that the right could be pushed to this, but the public itself and the left can't? And it's not that I'm saying, yes, I want these guys to raid the Capitol. It's not that. It's more so I'm looking at this and I have this kind of weird feeling of, well, the public should be angry at government. But the reason that these guys raided was ridiculous. It's that oddity, that trying to reconcile that I have a hard time reconciling. 4,000 people died that day. You realize that? Like on the day they raided the Capitol, 4,000 human beings, 4,000 Americans dropped dead. That was more than dropped dead on 9/11 when we were hit. Exactly the comparison I was about to make. That was more significant in its own way, a more significant event than 9/11. I mean, I don't want to change the subject too much, but just to throw this briefly in here, 2020, I would argue, started with the assassination of Qasem Soleimani. 2021 is starting like this. I think it's going to be another year. I think 2021 is going to be a more significant year than 2020. We will see. I mean, it's stupid to make it all about what starts the year off, and that's obviously not the only reason I'm saying that. But I'm just pointing it out. That's the inaugural event for this year. And basically, that's how this year's starting. That's astonishing to me. Yeah, that's astonishing to me. It's just seeing that happen. It's just like mind-blowing. And I know some people are like trying to downplay this and everything else. I don't think you can downplay this. I think this is a big deal. And I got to be honest, I really do think this could have turned out far, far worse. I think the way it turned out might have actually been the best case scenario, because if it would have been a few seconds where these guys got into the room with the congressman, what happens? What happens? Like, that's the part that becomes fascinating, and that's the part where it's like, oh God, I don't want to know this. And I'm sorry, like, I do think these questions need to be asked about legitimacy, justification, correctness, what makes it correct versus what not. I think these are just honest questions that people need to ask about their government, especially if their government is gone astray. It was something that the gentleman we had on Friday, I can't think of his name, Carmine, was basically arguing about the Second Amendment is like what would justify if you believe that the government was being toppled, that type of stuff. And the justification argument is the one that I'm most fascinated by. What justifies an action like this? And the only thing that I can think of, at least in our immediate environment, is the way government has magnificently, fundamentally failed. I mean, Trump gave a tax cut that basically increased taxes on the poor and the middle class. Like, put that in perspective. And this is during a time where income inequality was already off the scales. This was when Obama had given 95% of the income increase to the top 1%. And my thought was always, when does the public respond? And this happens. And it's like, oh God, this is what they respond for? I don't know. It's just very strange to me. It's very, very strange to me. And now the censorship. So there will be censorship and there will be an attack. Joe Biden is already basically talking about new domestic laws on domestic terrorism. Here's the catch. Do you believe that we don't have laws on domestic terrorism already? Like, do we really need additional laws on domestic terrorism, Shane? Or is it just a matter of them using the laws that are already on the books?
Well, so two brief additions to this. And yeah, we technically do, but there's also not like a single crime of domestic terrorism on a federal scale. Different states have different charges, domestic terrorism charges, but not all. So there could be some case to be made for that. And the other side to here is this is back in November that he was saying this stuff. So it's not literally precipitated by this election, but it's certainly precipitated by years of anti-government movements, whether those were Black Lives Matter or a little bit further back, the waves of much smaller scale protests that were happening in 2016 and 2014 with Black Lives Matter, and before that, of course, with the Tea Party and Occupy. Although I'm just gonna say it, the escalation has escalated over the years. It has gotten more and more pitched as time has gone on, to the point where last week, again, a mob of rioters raided the Capitol building. Can't understate that, and I don't think you can state that too many times. But do I think that he's going to do it? So as I was saying, technically, there could be a case that somebody could make for doing that. Do I think that the Biden administration will handle that carefully, or will create a definition of domestic terrorism that pretty much represents what most people would think of as terrorism, and that doesn't sweep under the definition all sorts of things that frankly shouldn't be defined as terrorism? No, of course not. I don't trust them to do that. We're entering an era, as far as I can tell, where the weight of the government is increasingly going to come down on not just violent speech, but on any potentially dangerous speech, and that speech would be dangerous for the establishment status quo.
Yes.
So that's gonna be happening. That's what we're going into right now. That's what this whole process inaugurated. So this whole process created, and it ties directly into information. Should people? I'll ask you this question. This is a little bit weird, and it's probably not as like not black and white, but not as severe as the question you were asking me. But should people be more angry about the election fraud, which is unproven? Some people think it happened. Some people think it didn't. Even the folks who think it might have happened or that it did happen don't necessarily think that it was on a large enough scale to overthrow the election. Should they be more angry about that, or about the media lying to them, obviously, for years and years and years and years? Because after that, and the reason I'm asking this, and I'll hand it to you, after that conversation with Piers Robinson, he's talking about the Herman and Chomsky model. I think he was referencing specifically the book Manufacturing Dissent. Like, information is much, much more instrumental in a democracy. It's the chronic syndrome. It's the chronic process by which democracy is subverted if that information is curated and managed by some elite. Should they be more frustrated about that, or should they be worried about the acute crisis that they saw in this election? What's your take, Jamarl?
This is somewhat of a trick question, because I would argue that the discrediting or the lying, the years of this kind of manufacturing consent and giving people information where the public knows that it's not quite right, it discredits media, it discredits institutions, and it gets people more in the mindset to do exactly what they did and disbelieving all of it. Meaning, yes, they should be angry. Yes, they should be upset. But the discrediting effect on media, when people don't necessarily entirely have the language to explain the propaganda effect of this stuff. Yeah, it discredits the process. They think that the media is lying. I think some of these guys believed that they were lying. I think some didn't care. But yeah, that's my thought on it. And by the way, Censor, they had gotten rid of Censor at one point. They got rid of Press TV at one point. They were getting rid of Palestinian sites. So I get people might be celebrating the elimination of Donald Trump. But like you said, Shane, if they get rid of Trump, anybody's fair game. And I would strongly wager or push to you that the various governments are probably going to start using these platforms as ways to silence opposition in their own countries. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We will be back in a moment.
Fault Lines. We are above all the latest developments, and we don't take any sides. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
Shooting from the lip.
We're taking no prisoners here. Real opinions for real people. So where we bring you people with controversial views, and instead of trying to catch them out, we actually let them expand on their views. What's going on in British politics, European politics, and indeed in world politics as well. And wherever you are, whether you're a UKIP supporter, a Tory or Labour, everything is in turmoil.
John Gaunt.
Shooting from the lip.
Fault Lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan, and we are joined by our guest, Jareth Copus. He is the author of Ukraine Forever Upon and a new book, Preparing for the Worst, How to Survive Natural and Man-Made Disasters from Mass Shootings to Tornadoes. I'm going to say, Jareth, thank you for joining us. How are you doing this morning? Jareth, you there? I believe we're in the process of trying to get Jareth on. Anyway, we're talking about his new book. I was just going to say it is a pretty sharp transition from his previous books, and I think it's on point. I think in terms of the 2020-2021 cycle, that's a significant sort of it's a sharp term, but I think it's also pretty timely. That's what I was going to say.
Well, yeah, for
Andre, do we have
2021? Yeah.
Yeah, do we have Jareth on? It seems like we're still in the process of trying to get him on. Anyway, it should. Okay.
Upon, I love the name of that book. I love the name of that book. You know, Ukraine. What is it? The name of it means in between or something like that. Like as a
like
nation.
The borderlands. That's often it's often a translation of it.
Yeah.
Hey, Jareth, I hear we have you on, but we've had a little bit of trouble. Could you try saying a few words there?
Yeah, you've got me. I can hear you. Can you hear me?
I can hear you now perfectly, loud and clear. Thank you for being with us. Yes. Pardon the bungled introduction, but as I'm sure you heard as we were talking about, it's a pretty sharp transition. We usually have you on, and usually when you're working and publishing online, as far as I can tell, you're talking about Ukraine, you're talking about the history, you're talking about the most recent coup, you're talking about just a bunch of stuff there. But now you've made the transition to this. I'm curious, what inspired that? It's a sort of standard question to ask an author, but what inspired that change? And, before we get into some of the contents of the book, why'd you publish it? Why'd you get into it? What's your thought on it, Jareth?
I didn't catch the total intro. You're talking about my change into speaking about survival or what?
Yes, pardon me. Yeah, exactly. Your new book. I thought you'd heard us.
Yeah, I had lost connection, so I didn't catch any of the intro. Yeah, my newest book, I've always been kind of a survival person. I've always been oriented towards being prepared for the worst. Kind of growing up poor, you kind of just inevitably you live that way. It's not something you learn to do. It's just inherent in how you're brought up. You have to be able to survive. So I kind of took those lessons I learned as a child and then reinforced them as I growing up in between Chicago and then the North Woods of Wisconsin. You kind of get the best of both worlds when it comes to survival. And I felt like in our current situation and in the world, how it's going, I think it's good to have this type of skill set in order to be prepared for whatever can happen. Because obviously now our capital was just attacked by our own people. So what can't happen, really?
Yeah, that's true. And give or take, 60 days or so, the Congress is going to have to be notified by law at this point about UFOs. And so into everything else in the ruckus that has taken place, we now can add alien attacks. How would you survive an alien attack? I don't know if this is part of your book, but
that is not. But I personally don't know that one. I think I could figure it out. I would have
survival. That has to be a part of it. That has to be a chapter these days, with everything that's going on in 2020. Of course, I'm teasing. I'm slightly teasing. I'm your first book, Ukraine Forever Upon. I am enamored by the title for that, Forever Upon. Why did you name it Ukraine Forever Upon? Why Forever Upon? Why that phrase?
Well, if you look back at history at the land of Ukraine, it's always been under the thumb of one superpower or the other. It's never really had its own independence. Even in 1991, when it claimed its own independence, it was still quickly being pushed to the west. So this land, this borderland, that's what Ukraine means, has constantly been under someone else's rule, searching for its own identity, struggling for its own people, and never really attaining it.
And with this, I want to come back for a minute to this new book. In a broad sense, it makes perfect sense why you wrote that. Good to know about your history with it. And of course, after 2020, going into 2021, a couple of rough years in the making. I can understand why a lot of people would be interested in those topics. And speaking personally, although I've wanted to move on to a homestead for a long time, but I'll put it like this. I do a bit more now and a bit sooner if I can because of the events that are happening here. But in a broad sense, what would you recommend in terms of mindset? And, if you're thinking in terms of preparing for a bunch of different kinds of events, an array of possible disasters that could be happening soon, what would you recommend that people focus on, both materially, psychologically, even spiritually? Jareth, what's your take?
So materially, you have to be prepared for 2 months without any sort of help from anybody. You have to be able to survive food-wise, water-wise, heat-wise. If you're in an area that's cold, depending on your climate, it's going to vary differently, but you need to be prepared 2 months where you don't need to go to the store. You don't need to depend on someone delivering something to you. You need to be able to stand on your own 2 feet for at least that long. Mentally, right now is a time where you need to be mentally vigilant every second of every day. You have to be on high alert with everything, especially when you're, I say in town because I'm out in the country, so we call it when you go into town. You have to be extremely vigilant. If you're in the city, you should already be extremely vigilant. You're surrounded by people you don't know. That's not saying be a paranoid person. I don't want people to think that this involves any sort of paranoia. It's just knowing that in this time of uncertainty, people are likely to easily snap. And that's an obvious thing. That's not speculation. That happens every day now. So it's just the fact of being ever vigilant. And spiritually, I'm not really a spiritual guy. And I think you need to kind of remove faith from how you plan because it doesn't really add much into where you're going. But if spirituality is your thing, you need to be able to call on what it is deep inside you that will get you to get through certain things. And if that's God, if that's Buddha, whoever, then yeah, you should be fully prepared for that as well.
Trust. It seems that the issue is one of trust. That, a family member, you get that family member, you grew up with that family member, you have this kind of certain idea of trust, even from the standpoint of relationships. When I really think about people who make these love songs and everything else, and it does apply. I know this sounds off the wall, but the idea of getting somebody else, I don't think it's the sex. I don't even think it's the camaraderie. I think it's the idea of trust, that you found somebody that you, at the very least, in this lonely world where you have to basically deal with on your own, somebody that you believe is going to walk that lonely road with you. Isn't that the issue? When you're talking about other people saying when you go into town, you have to be vigilant. Well, vigilant for what? Because you can't necessarily trust the people around you and you need to be vigilant anyway. The issue here is trust. Do you think environment, from the standpoint of an environment that is more difficult, creates, let's say, an atmosphere of less trust, where that feeling of vigilance feels like it needs to be that much more so? Meaning, what's the thing that you think is creating this increase in temperature of us engaging one another?
Sure. Well, I don't think it's anything new, and it's kind of been a problem in especially Western society for quite some time now. We've kind of gone away from a world where we are human beings to a world where we're human having. So in this process, we've kind of lost our sense of community, that trust that we always have had. We've relied on each other, not even just our family members, but everyone else. We've lost that communal sense of living, and we need to get that back. That's a big point of what my book is about, too, is not turning away from everyone and becoming a person who hides in his basement in a radiation suit. It's about turning back to community, becoming a good member of society that people can trust, because we have lost that. We've all forgotten that if you took the most ghetto Black Lives Matter member or the most redneck Proud Boy and put them in a room, we still have more in common, those two people, than we have with anybody in Congress, anybody on Capitol Hill. Those people don't know what it's like for how we, as either a Proud Boy, Black Lives Matter, Antifa, we have more in common than we have with them. And we've gotten away from that. We don't trust each other. We've been divided by these people for too long. We need to come back to a community. We need to remember that we're together.
That sounds noble, and it also sounds good. And for a second, at the beginning of your response there, it almost sounded spiritual. You're talking about the move from being to having, the move from some essential, integral existence as a part of your society or a part of your community to mere possession of goods. And I agree on that front, and I agree overall here. This is also moving towards something like localism, not necessarily in the long term politically, but getting back into building up your local community. And that seems particularly salient, but also particularly difficult during the pandemic, when we're all in lockdown, when you can't see each other face to face for the most part, unless you're talking over Zoom or something. Do you have any recommendations or tips for people on building community specifically? Because as you're saying, vital. Jareth.
Sure. Well, it's nothing new to people who live kind of in the boonies. Out here, you kind of have to look out for one another. People think you move out to the country, you move out into the middle of nowhere to get away from people, but really it helps you realize how much you depend on others. So, I mean, just now we're having to cut wood. If people are short of wood, we're able to take people. If someone says, okay, I wasn't able to get as much as I need, we're going to freeze to death. You happily take some wood over to people. When you have to, it's getting pushed back to those more basic times and having to realize what's actually important. Food, fire, shelter, water, being able to realize that as a community, we can help each other attain those things. We don't need to keep up with the Joneses, who has the best new car and things like that. That pits us against one another. So all those frivolous little things only add to that disconnect between communities. So if we get rid of that type of thing, we're able to realize, yeah, we should be helping each other out regardless. And yeah, during these times, it's difficult. You have to stay 6 feet away, but you can stay 6 feet away, put on a mask, and still go out and help people, especially if you're outside doing actual work instead of stuff inside.
And I can see that. I mean, we've got to go into a break. I can see that in my family. My mom in particular, I don't usually talk about my family. She is about as cautious about COVID. My stepdad has, serious potential issues that, comorbidities. So she's very cautious about not infecting him, not getting infected. At the same time, however, over the past couple of years, she's increasingly become a part of local gardening communities, local foraging communities, raising chickens, and sharing produce, receiving and giving with her neighbors, most of whom she's met online. And so it is possible. I just want to back that up. And it's good to see that happening. And I think that you're right. That is what we should be pushing for. In any event, we have to go into a break. We are joined by Jareth Copus. He's the author of Ukraine Forever a Pawn and Preparing for the Worst, How to Survive Natural and Man-Made Disasters from Mass Shootings to Tornadoes. And by the way, you can follow Jareth on Twitter at Rodion Press and find his books on rodionpress.com. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We'll be right back.
Fault Lines.
Want to know how international issues fit into local ones and how local issues fit into international ones with the historical context to tie them together? Well, we're bringing it to you all by any means necessary. Tune in weekdays from 2 to 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time to hear me, Jackie Lukman, alongside my co-host, Sean Blackman. By any means necessary, your guide to connecting the social, political, and economic movements shaping the world around us.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined by my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in Washington, D.C. Joining us is author of Ukraine Forever a Pawn and Preparing for the Worst, How to Survive the Natural and Man-Made Disasters from Mass Shootings to Tornadoes, Jareth Copus. Jareth, again, welcome back to the show, man. Thank you for joining us.
Yeah, again, thanks for having me on.
Your response to Shane was very humanistic. This idea that we, in our modern society, modernity, we've lost something, some aspect of us that we don't necessarily have, that you're getting back to by getting back to nature and getting back to the basic necessities of life, this kind of Maslow's theory of needs. That also gets to a certain level of protectionism, meaning despite the humanism and despite the idea of working together and helping one another, there is an understanding in the kind of prepper mentality, and I don't want to put that as a negative. Meaning, I'm not saying that as to attack more so. I'm just more so getting it as a description. But the idea that
prepper is okay. It's when you get to the people that I call them doomsdayers. I know the type of person you're insinuating at. There's a difference between a prepper and a doomsdayer.
Exactly right. I'm trying to make a distinction. I don't want one to be seen as an attack or like as undermining. But from the standpoint of getting to this notion that when things go to pot for whatever particular reason, that at some point there's an element of this of protecting yourself and protecting your own. And how does that interplay with the humanism aspect? Is it just a basic reality of things where it's, look, there's a pragmatism associated with any notion of survival that you have to deal with you and your own, ensuring that you guys are safe first, and it's understanding that the environment out there will be hostile to your safety. How does all of that fit in? How do you view all of that, especially now when you're not necessarily at that point where everything falls apart, and yet there's signs that things are falling apart?
I think it's less of becoming protectionist and more of becoming a person who holds others accountable and becoming a part of a society where you know that you will be held accountable for improper actions. And as improper actions, that's on the basis of, I guess you could even take that back to spirituality, a lot of what the Bible talks about. If you're murdering people, if you're a bad person for any of the commonly accepted terms for a bad person, then you're going to be held accountable for it. And we've even kind of lost that in our world. People get away with things all the time now. Cops get away with murdering innocent people. I mean, our government officials get away with starting wars. So we've gotten away from accountability for our actions, and people need to, that's part of the humanism, is realizing you are a part of something more than just yourself, and you need to hold yourself and others accountable for their actions and be able to correct that in a certain way.
I mean, a slight complication here is that it seems like, religion and politics are classically the two topics that you're not supposed to bring up during a dinner with more or less strangers. Topics of sort of impolite conversation that will tend to divide people. If anything, it's really politics and politics these days. People, as far as I can tell, can bond across religious boundaries, but it is becoming increasingly difficult to bond across political boundaries. And it's weird because on the one hand, working with your local community is the sort of primordial classic way of providing for political needs, providing for the needs of a community of people who have some power, and they're having to share that power and balance that power, but also use that power, and it will be centralized in certain people. And so if community is the original politics and modern day politics is breaking up community, I mean, it's kind of just a dilemma. And I might be phrasing that or framing that in a way that you disagree with, Jareth. But how would you try to balance the needs of those two things? Because again, if there's one thing that's going to keep people apart today from forming as a community, it is more than likely going to be politics. What's your take, Jareth?
Well, I guess I always look back to the Iroquois, and for thousands of years, they were able to unite the tribes of North America and rule in actual peace. There was community. There was a time where in this country, before Europeans came over, that there was a large period of peace between a great amount of differing nations, of people who were completely different in a multitude of ways. Yet there was still some sort of control via a state-type body. It was obviously very different then, but I don't think it's impossible to try something different than the current way of politics we have, I guess.
Wait, what do you mean? Explain that. You mean just a different organization? Do you think the organization that we have now basically incentivizes poor behavior and incentivizing poor behavior kind of creates the conditions that undermine the system in and of itself? Meaning, if it collapses because of a logic that is built into it that doesn't necessarily see to the best interest of maintaining it, whether that's economic or, like you said, whether that's accountability, where some people seem to be completely accountable, meaning from the standpoint of the law or whatever else, and others get to pass. Is that what you mean? That's what it sounds like you're saying, that basically the structures that we've built up over time have not served us well, especially as we've proceeded and things have gone on. And that basically the collapse of this stuff has a lot to do with what has gone on as we've gone about our way. That's what it sounds like you're saying. Is that fair?
Yeah, we've lost our way in the path towards democracy. We don't have democracy. At our current time, we have a techno-fascist state ruled by a group of corporations and elites, and that's basic. I think not many people would disagree with that at this point. So we've gotten away from that democracy where our voice matters, where what we say and what we do has any sort of ramification. And I think that the isolation that those people on the Capitol Hill felt, the isolation that people in Black Lives Matter protests felt, I think that's lends to this fascism spreading even further. And that's the worst part, is we're so divided and we're so alone now, especially with COVID as well, that we are only going to continue down this path of destruction in this country. And if we don't quickly turn away from that divisiveness, that isolationist, then it's going to be irreparable.
And that seems to be, by the way, I agree with your characterization of the state completely. Techno-fascist seems to fit the bill. But I mean, and here's the thing that could tie together, I think, a lot of elements of both political parties, the alternative wings of both political parties, and frankly, just the alternatives of the establishment itself, because I think that traditional party ties are sort of starting to break down. I think most people on the fringes and a lot of people in the center would agree completely with that characterization, I would say, looking at it. Especially after this weekend's events with Trump getting taken off Twitter and with Parler getting taken down, you might have had some folks on the right. Really not, though. I think the vast majority of folks the alternatives of both of the wings would agree completely on that. Is there any, coming back to politics for a second, and that might be from your view, not the most useful direction to take this in, because, and I might be filling in slightly, because if you go there, then suddenly you're getting back into politics, you're getting into, frankly, likely mass politics in order to try to change the status quo. Where would you take that, Jareth? If the alternatives on the fringes of the American culture, and frankly of global culture, agree on that, is there something they can do with that shared agreement, or it begs the question politically, what is that going to create? Is that going to create some new party or some new movement? What's your take?
I don't think we should depend on parties. I don't think we should depend on movements, because when you put a label on things, they're quickly taken advantage of. And I think that Black Lives Matter is a very good example of that. I think what needs to happen is, this isn't something that can happen overnight. We've been heading on this course since almost the inception of our country, really. So it's a very difficult thing to happen. But that the very beginning step is turning back towards localism, like you said, turning back towards learning who your neighbors are, learning what you can do to become a better member of your society, to be a better member of your block, of your neighborhood, of your acreage, what you can do to help out others. We have to start turning away from having and from proving that you're something more than somebody else to how you can be a helpful person to others.
I think I agree with that. I think the problem is that, look, I think we're at the point that we're at because the logic of it demanded that we be here. Meaning the software, the code of sorts, and the way that our society has been organized pushed us to this place. I don't know if it's enough to say, hey, we should be local, because if the logic of it was for us to be local, we'd be local. Meaning, I guess I'm getting at is how we've organized ourselves in a society is around the pursuit of profit. The pursuit of profit was given this idea of being the point, having resources, the ability to feed yourself, but it went beyond the ability to just be able to feed yourself into this kind of issue of status in and of itself. And that's the part that I don't know how to turn back or turn around. We have about 2.5 minutes. Do you agree with me on that? Because it seems like a lot of the arguments that you're making is basically against this idea of materialism, but the materialism seems built into our environment. At the very least, our system, our economic system.
Yeah, it's completely built into our society, and that's, I think, like I've been saying, is part of the problem. And I think that is, like I said, the most difficult part of turning away from this type of humans having into humans being. So that's the biggest issue, is having people realize that it's not about owning, or that it's not about having the latest phone or car or anything like that. And that's been ingrained in our society for hundreds of years in America. That's what we are. We're the consumerist country. So we have to turn away from consumerism. And that's, I don't have answers on how to keep that a part of people's forefront in their brain of turning away from that. So the best thing that I can do is be an example. If I can provide the example in my community of not having to rely on becoming the person who has the most, then that's me doing my part. So I would just encourage people to not think you're going to change anything overnight, and be the example of what you want to see as the change.
So let's do this.
And I agree with that. Yeah, we can close it out here, I think. Jareth, thank you so much for joining us. We're out of time. Really appreciate you being with us.
Yeah, thanks for having me on.
For those listening, that was the voice of Jareth Copus. He is the author of Ukraine Forever Upon and Preparing for the Worst, How to Survive Natural and Man-Made Disasters, from mass shootings to tornadoes. And by the way, you can follow Jareth on Twitter at Rodion Press and find his books on rodionpress.com. And I've got to say, Jamarl, on pretty much every count there, I agree with him. I think that part of where this goes is you're talking about, these underlying trends. I think the one that you brought up was the profit motive. I would see it in a deeper sense, in the sort of deeper, like Tocqueville's Democracy in America sense, as the motive to centralize power, the motive to create some authority that can solve your problems for you instead of trying to solve your problems yourself, not literally on your own as an individual, but in your local community. In the same way that the Roman Empire had a centralizing trend and then a decentralizing trend, I would say that the American Empire is hitting the inflection point where it's heading towards a decentralization trend. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We'll be back with headlines in just a minute.
Listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Fault lines.
live from across the divided states of America. It is time now for another edition, another hour, our last hour this morning of the most disruptive show covering American politics and global politics. In the Independent Corner, I am your political analyst, Shane Stranahan.
And in the left corner, I am the indefatigable, the last man on the wall, your political analyst, Jamarl Thomas.
And together we are Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Going into the news, in the headlines, first up in COVID news, at least 1,777 new coronavirus deaths and 208,000 new cases were reported in the United States yesterday, January 10th. Over the past week, there has been an average of 254,866 cases per day, an increase of 38% from the average 2 weeks earlier, and almost 375,000 people have died. New York City opened 2 massive COVID-19 vaccination hubs Sunday. The sites will be operating 24/7 until everyone in New York City is vaccinated. Doctors, nurses, COVID testing, and inoculation staffers, and nursing home employees and residents have already gotten the green light for vaccination. Today, school employees, including teachers, first responders such as police and firefighters, and public transit workers, are allowed to begin getting vaccinated. As of Saturday overnight, fewer than half the vaccines that the city has received had been doled out, or 203,000 out of 524,000 about. Of those 203,000, about 185,000 were the first dose. Johnson & Johnson is expected to deliver preliminary late-stage trial results for its one-dose COVID vaccine candidate by the end of January. If its job is proven to be safe and effective, the company aims to deliver at least 1 billion doses by the end of the year. House lawmakers may have been exposed to someone testing positive for COVID-19 while they sheltered at an undisclosed location during the Capitol siege by a violent mob loyal to President Trump. The Capitol's attending physician notified all lawmakers Sunday of the virus exposure and urged them to be tested. The infected individual was not named. In national political news, House Speaker Nancy Pelosi announced the House will be moving forward with a resolution to impeach President Trump, referring to the president in a letter to colleagues as a quote-unquote imminent threat to the U.S. Constitution and democracy. On Monday, House leaders will work to swiftly pass legislation to do that. If it is blocked by Republicans, the House will convene for a full House vote on Tuesday. Pelosi explained that the resolution calls on VP Mike Pence to convene and mobilize the cabinet to activate the 25th Amendment to declare the president incapable of executing the duties of his office. Under the procedure, the vice president, quote, would immediately exercise powers as acting president, end quote. Trump is due to leave office on January 20th. Jamarl, I'm going to turn to you now, actually, on this one. On the topic of impeachment, it seems to me like there are two sort of competing reasons here, like for why they're pushing the impeachment. And it's not even an obvious thing to wonder about, because some people will just look at this and go, well, clearly, of course, he should be impeached after what he did. But another take is, he's going to be out of office anyway in, 9 days now? So that's imminent. It seems to me that there are two reasons, however. One, and this is the sort of superficial, on the nose, very obvious one, which is they simply want Biden in there faster. They don't want Trump to do anything dangerous, and they want to accelerate Biden's transition, giving him more time, effectively, to work with Vice President Pence to try to make things go as smoothly as they possibly can. And then the second, deeper and slightly less superficial, but still pretty obvious one, is they want to make an example of Trump. They want to push him out. They want to show as clearly as they can that this is not to be tolerated. And of course, I'm guessing that this is going to be serving as a precedent for follow-up lawsuits filed against Trump, willy-nilly. Jamarl, though, what's your case? What do you think of this? Why do you think they're doing this? What do you think the benefit to them is? Do you think it should go through? And what do you think is going to follow on from this?
So the impeachment thing is still weird to me. I mean, George Bush had 1 million people killed and Pelosi basically said I knew Bush was lying, and she still wasn't willing to impeach. Because in many of their heads, impeachment is such a divisive act that it basically breaks the country in half. Now, the reality of it is they think they can get away with it with Trump because they don't believe that Trump has institutional support among other Republicans where they would throw themselves on a fire to basically protect. Now, the first time around, the impeachment was utterly and entirely ridiculous. Basically, they were trying to impeach Trump for something that Joe Biden got on stage and bragged about. This time around, Trump has jumped the shark. And there are some Republicans that look at what Trump did as problematic. I mean, think about the shining city on a hill that Reagan talks about, the glittering city that people see and they look up to, this exceptional nation. Well, the exceptional nation just had its capital ransacked and raided by people who were basically dropping bombs that apparently took a dump in Pelosi's desk or various people's desks. Look, I don't think this is a hard one. I mean, I can understand the rationale for impeaching Trump, but I don't believe the rationale that they're giving is the rationale that's there. I strongly suspect that they want to prevent Trump from ever running again, especially in 2024, and I agree with you. They want to humiliate him. I also think they want to distract from other stuff, meaning they're going to use Donald Trump as a boogeyman for later on. And I think that is the reality of this. Meaning the thing to haunt Democrats' dreams, where they could say, hey, you guys decided not to vote for Hillary Clinton and we ended up with Trump, and look at what we had to do for Trump. He tried to have an insurgency and we had to impeach him. I think part of this is to use Trump as the boogeyman for their worst nightmares for later on when they try to scare people to vote for whatever random Democrat. And I also think, yeah, they're trying to humiliate him. So I look, also there's a third thing. They probably were freaked out. Like, under normal circumstances, members of Congress are not touched by the things that happen to the nation. Nancy Pelosi with $200 million in the bank is not typically touched by the things that happen in the real world. Well, having these guys having to run and hide in a room and everything else, they were touched. And they probably feel some kind of way about being touched, even though the reason was utterly ridiculous. And so, no, I don't know if this is, put it this way, if there was a reason to impeach Trump, this would probably be it. And this would have been far more of a good reason as opposed to the other reason that they used prior. This is better than the previous reason. Whether they should impeach him or not, I don't know. I vacillate back and forth on this. I think this was a massive, massive deal. I do think Trump encouraged this. So I can't necessarily be mad and upset with him for impeaching him. By the same token, it seems utterly ridiculous to impeach the guy 2 weeks before he leaves office, and at the point where he's been utterly and entirely politically tarnished. I don't know, it just feels like a distraction from other stuff. But I could be wrong. But Trump has set the justification for it in his actions. So I can't even say they're entirely wrong. I just don't believe the reasons that they're given are the reasons that they're actually doing it for.
He has, yeah. This whole thing, I mean, between the events of last Wednesday and the response to them, and it's weird because on the one hand, it feels circus-like or something like this, or dream-like, where there is simultaneously a very like illusionary, imagistic, sort of symbolic quality to what was going on, and yet at the same time, and sort of light, like a lot of what was going on in the Capitol building, people getting high in the White House. It's not like there was a genuine, there was a threat. It's not that there was a genuine threat of completely overturning the U.S. government, but there was a threat. But it was very performative. I don't know how else to put this. At the same time as it was performative, they were showing up ready to lynch politicians, showing up, like you were saying, with zip ties and credible threats of violence against the vice president, as well as congressional officials. So I do not want to downplay the extent to which this could have actually been bloody. And of course it already was, but bloody for lawmakers there. And yet at the same time, do you see what I'm saying about how like performative this whole thing was and how it was like a show coup or something like that? Does that make any sense?
They were never going to topple the government by attacking these two guys. Like, meaning even if they took the Capitol, even if they took the congressman, there was no chance of them ever overturning it. Like, you would need institutional support. You would have needed Pence. You would have needed many of the other Republicans that were backing on that. Yeah, it feels like a dreamlike quality. I mean, the guy wearing a mask, you know, like you said, smoking pot in the offices of the Capitol, like, it seems so bizarre. It seems utterly bizarre. It doesn't seem like they were serious, even though they were serious because people got injured. And you can look at the videos. Some of those videos were utterly terrifying with these guys coming through trying to get into the room with the congressman. It feels very bizarre. It feels very, very bizarre. It's a surreal quality to this. I agree with you.
It's like they were LARPing as revolutionaries, but instead of using foam swords or wood swords, they were using real swords. But they didn't know what they were doing, and you know, they could have. It was dangerous. They could have killed people, and obviously, numerous people have now died. I think it's up to 5 now at this point, maybe 6. So numerous people have died. But yeah, it's real. Anyway, other headlines to get to
real
here.
Quick, do you think they were shocked by their success? Meaning, like, you get to the Capitol and all of a sudden, hey,
100%.
And oh wow, we can do this, we can do that. oh, wow, I'm in Pelosi's room. Oh, I'm going to steal this laptop. Like, it was opportunistic as it was taking place, meaning one thing kind of just led to the other, where these kind of opportune moments presented themselves and you just took the opportunity.
Yes. Yeah. Have you ever been in the middle of like a sort of war zone protest situation where there's like tear gas flying around and flashbangs going off, that kind of thing?
No,
have you ever been in that, Jamarl?
No, I've been to the Washington, D.C. protests, but they weren't doing that at the time.
I've been in at least two of those. But two stick to mind. One was a May Day protest. One was back during Occupy. And I'll put it like this. It's not, there are massive differences between that and what happened last Wednesday. But what comes to mind for me is the feeling of like adrenaline-fueled exhilaration as you're in this intense situation. And I from that experience, I wasn't actively taking part in either of those protests, wasn't really taking part at all. But from that experience, I know what that's like. And it's a good feeling. I'm not going to lie. It can be a bad feeling if your eyes and throat and nose are stinging from tear gas and you got snot rolling down your face. That's not so pleasant. But the feeling of like running and being involved in that, again, I'm not saying I condone that. I wasn't there as a participant. I was there reporting, actually. But that's an interesting feeling. And so, yes, they were shocked. They were probably elated. They were surprised, and they were feeling very powerful at that moment. That's my guess there. Anyway, back to the headlines. 2 U.S. Capitol police officers are now dead as a result of the Capitol siege. Brian Sicknick, who suffered injuries during the riot on Wednesday and succumbed to those injuries the following day on Thursday. And now, Howard Levengood, who committed suicide on Saturday. Levengood was a 15-year veteran who responded to the Capitol riot in the halls of Congress. The U.S. Capitol Police are not directly linking Levengood's death to Wednesday's riots, as he was off duty when he killed himself. The 2022 PGA Championship, which had been scheduled since 2014 to be played at Trump National in Bedminster, will not take place there in the wake of the outbreak of violence at the Capitol. The PGA of America, the governing body for the major championship, on Sunday voted to move the event from the New Jersey golf course because of its ties with Trump. Parler, a social media app popular with conservatives and supporters of President Donald Trump, has gone offline after Amazon withdrew its support in the wake of the deadly U.S. Capitol riot. The app was reliant on cloud computing power that was provided by Amazon Web Services, that's AWS. AWS told Parler on Saturday that it will no longer provide cloud services to the company beginning on Sunday at 11:59 p.m. Pacific time. John Matzey, the founder and CEO of Parler, said in a statement on Monday that the Parler app will be down, quote-unquote, longer than expected because other cloud hosting companies do not want to work with Parler in light of the press statements issued by Amazon, Google, and Apple. Apple removed Parler from the iPhone App Store on Saturday. The company said that posts on Parler related to the U.S. Capitol riot included calls for violence, which violates Apple's rules against objectionable content. On Friday, Twitter permanently banned Trump from the social media platform, citing the risk that he would incite further violence. Adamant supporter of Trump and radio host Rush Limbaugh then deactivated his own Twitter account. Trump's personal attorney, Rudy Giuliani, appeared on Steve Bannon's YouTube podcast, War Room. While he was there, he placed blame on the Democratic Party for Wednesday's Capitol siege, arguing that it was orchestrated to make President Trump look bad. A few hours later, YouTube removed that episode and entirely banned Steve Bannon's podcast channel, War Room, altogether. And briefly going into international news here, politician Sadir Japarov is on course to a landslide victory in Kyrgyzstan's snap presidential election, which was triggered by the collapse of the previous government, winning almost 80% of the vote on Sunday in the Central Asian nation. Japarov, who was sentenced to a lengthy prison term for kidnapping a provincial governor as part of his protest, had his verdict quashed amid the October unrest and has outspent 16 presidential poll rivals by a wide margin. His Sriwijaya airplane, a Boeing 737-500, an Indonesian passenger jet with 62 people on board, crashed into the ocean on Saturday. Only 4 minutes into the flight, the plane dropped 10,000 feet in less than a minute and then disappeared from the radar. Rescuers have located the plane's black box flight recorder and obtained communications data. More details will come soon regarding the cause of the crash after they analyze the contents of that black box flight recorder. And in my last headline here, Facebook has taken down a network in Uganda linked to the country's Ministry of Information for using fake and duplicate accounts to post ahead of this week's presidential election on Thursday, which pits longtime leader Yoweri Museveni against 10 candidates, including opposition frontrunner Bobi Wine, a singer-turned-lawmaker whose star power has rattled the ruling party. And with that, those are our headlines. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. and we are going into a break. On the other side of this break, we'll be back with Jim Jotras. You're listening, again, to Fault Lines. Be right back.
Fault Lines. 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. We give you the most essential information out there. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
Stuck in traffic? No problem. Stay informed. Stay tuned to Radio Sputnik on 105.5 FM or 1390 AM in the Washington, D.C. area. Need more? Follow us on Facebook or check us out on SputnikNews.com.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined by my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in Washington, D.C. Joining us is James George Jotras, Washington, D.C. based government and media relations specialist. He's also an attorney licensed in the District of Columbia and in Pennsylvania who has appeared before the U.S. Supreme Court and has previously served as U.S. diplomat and U.S. Senate staffer. Jim, welcome to the show, man. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you. They're thrilled to be back.
Absolutely. So you've been a U.S. Senate staffer. You've worked in Washington. You've also been a diplomat. Let's start at the most basic, from your perspective of being inside the chamber, of working inside, let's say, the chamber. What did you think as you watched all of these people basically siege the Capitol under the notion that Donald Trump was cheated?
Well, I think two things came to mind. One was to try to figure out exactly what was happening up there, and because I don't necessarily, in fact, I'm very skeptical of any description we get from the media of saying this happened, that happened, who really was responsible for the outcome of the events up there. But what was, I think, more of concern to me at that time, and even more so in the days since, is what will be done with this. In other words, once the narrative is established that domestic terrorists have trashed our democracy and it's an insurrection, it was pretty clear to me that this is kind of like a Reichstag fire, that this will be used for an immense, broad crackdown on anything like free speech, to demonize any opposition to the new woke regime that's about to come to power, and that effectively constitutional government and the rule of law in this country is dead. And it wasn't killed by so-called right-wing insurrectionists or the Trump deplorables or anything like that. It's being killed by the tech companies. It's being killed by the deep state government agencies. And we've crossed some kind of Rubicon. We're in uncharted territories right now in terms of where this country goes next.
And let's follow up on that. And after Wednesday, on Friday, Twitter completely banned Trump. This was after suspending his account starting Wednesday for 12 hours. And then they just dropped the hammer, removing his account. And then over the weekend, Parler, the sort of alternative to Twitter social media platform, removed from Apple and Google's app stores. And then on Sunday, AWS completely dropped that social media platform. So if there is a response, and obviously there is one, it seems like it's taking place mostly in terms of the discourse online. I'm guessing you're worried about that, Jim, but like you're saying, we're in uncharted territories. With that, I'm still going to ask, where do you think that takes us? What do you think the consequences of this are going to be? And what alternatives do you think people can realistically find if, in expectation, they believe that whatever they have to say, if it's dangerous, will be suppressed, and whatever platform they find, if it's safe, that will eventually be uprooted? Jim, what's your take?
Well, exactly right. And I think the premise of the question is, it's a very American one, is that, well, we have a problem, what's the solution? And sometimes problems don't have solutions. In other words, there may be no place to go that you can actually communicate, that you won't be shut down. In other words, unless you have a platform that's completely vertically integrated, including finance, they're going to be susceptible to some kind of censorship, that they either by technical means, by getting servers pulled or any, you look at Parler, even their lawyers quit over threats. And by the way, we even saw this during the election challenge, where lawyers representing Trump pulled out of the representation because, well, these are evil claims, and we're going to ruin your business. We're going to make sure you're blacklisted as lawyers if you represent this guy. And that's the kind of pressure that can be put on any point, including, for example, things like finance, like as we've seen with people getting their PayPal accounts pulled. So there may be a situation created where there really is no free speech platform you can go to without it either being shut down or being demanded it starts censoring as well. And by the way, this is one of the foolish things about Trump's demand that to yank Section 230 of the Communications Act that gave them immunity from libel, gave them libel protection so that they would be a bulletin board, a free speech platform. Well, if you pull that, then basically they're going to say, well, we are liable now as editors. We have to censor everything because we could be held liable. I don't see how you actually make them do the things that they're supposed to do and to respect free speech, because after all, the people who are now taking power benefited from all this. Just like we hear talk about the election. Well, we need to look at some election reform. Who's going to enact those reforms? The people who just benefited from the lack of reform? I just don't see where the end game is that preserves any modicum of free speech or Republican government.
Let's stay there for the moment on this notion of the free speech stuff and companies. All of these companies are basically capitalistic endeavors. They're private industry, private companies. They're not necessarily connected to the United States government, at least in this kind of direct way. There is indirect pressure, meaning some of the rules that can be passed or the laws that can be passed that can make their lives miserable. But a lot of the pressure for this seems to be coming from people who are on the platform. You have congressional members that are basically Democrats with a large number of the population agreeing. And you even have, unfortunately, a group of Republicans that basically agree with this notion of censorship. And I agree with you with the Section 230. I mean, basically what they would scream at that point is, well, we're not a platform. We don't have these protections, so we can't put any of this speech out in the first place. How do we as a society mend that gap? Because that gap is there. The idea of the public commons and the ability for people to be able to make their conversations and have their speeches, and the capacity that is not the public commons, it can be shut down through technological means. I mean, basically, you have a blacklisting of right-wingers. I mean, not all of them, but people who were involved in this particular run-up. So what's the middle ground? How do we mind that gap? How do we mend that? Because there does seem to be this kind of weird juxtaposition here. We're giving over basically our commons to private enterprise. These are the results of that, where private enterprise gets to basically tell the President of the United States to shut up. What's the middle ground? How do we mind that gap? How do we maneuver this in a way that preserves the idea of, let's say, some semblance of free speech, by the same token, keep these guys as private enterprise? And is it possible to do both?
That's what I'm saying, Jamarl. I'm not sure it is possible. I hope it's possible. If there is a road to that, I don't see it, because as you point out, these are private companies, and of course, even many conservatives, so-called, and Republicans and whatnot are saying all along. In fact, as this kind of tightening on free speech has been going along, well, it's not censorship. It's not a violation of the First Amendment. These are private companies. Private companies can do whatever they want on their platform, and of course, the private companies. I think one of our concerns I have, and you think some people on the left would have the same concerns, is when you have this unholy alliance between big woke corporations and government agencies that is very, very tight, very, very symbiotic, that you almost have something close to what I would call corporate state capture, that we really have. It used to be when government and big companies worked so closely together, there was a word about that. What was it called back in the 30s? I think it was fascism. You think some people would be concerned about that, but since it's kind of a rainbow fascist, it's kind of woke fascist, the content of the ideological content is quote on the left is to some extent. I think people on that side see that there's any kind of threat from it, because after all, it's our fascism and we're crushing people that are bad. Remember, I think we crossed the Rubicon on this a while back, where it became established during the BLM and the Antifa actions during the summer that left-wing violence is speech, but right-wing speech is violence. hate speech is violence. So whatever, and of course, we get to define what is hate speech. If you use the wrong term, if you pronounce Kamala Harris's name wrong, anything can be hate speech if the wokesters say it is, and then you will be shut down. Then where do you go?
Yeah, Jim, it's Kamala. I think we have to drop you. I'm sorry, man.
There you go. Sorry, we'll drop the call.
Good
there you go.
No, I'm just messing with you. Yeah, we were having a conversation earlier about this topic with Piers Robinson, talking about propaganda, the nature of the beast, and where we could go. And he was similarly befuddled. What he recommended, though, was people move to sort of offline discourse, move to more local forms of communication sharing. And he brought up specifically pamphlets and leaflets and things like that, which bring to my mind the era of the Soviet Union, samizdat, and the sharing of forbidden literature, and what we might see on the other side of this, because even though Parler's taken down, even though Twitter's blocking a bunch of speech, and of course Facebook and Twitter have been doing this in droves for a long time now, at the same time, you still have email, you still have email services that you can use, you still have apps like Signal that you can share. You might get something like cyber samizdat, where at the same time as you have written, published literature that's circulating, you do have privately distributed online literature, blog posts and essays and news stories and such, but it's not going to be a network. It's not going to be at least a public network that people can access. And I'm guessing similarly to the Soviet Union, even if you can block people's access to information, even if you can block their access to sharing widely, to publishing that information, what you're going to get is certain groups silently circulating that information and a deeper, wary uneasiness that increases and grows about the state of society. And of course, we saw that back in 2016. A lot of people note that was one of the main causes of Trump getting elected. And my only assumption here is that that's going to grow. We can't. I agree with you, Jim. I don't see a way out of this either. I was saying the other day, it's sort of like passing between Scylla and Charybdis with the dangers we're being posed here. But you might be able to find sort of personal solutions to this. And I'm curious about your take on that. Even if we can't solve this problem as a society, if you as an individual want to stay relatively sane, relatively emotionally healthy, and build up some material means of self-support so that you can, weather this storm, however long this storm lasts and whatever it looks like. Do you have any recommendations there, Tim? Jim, what do you think people should do?
Well, I do think your comparison to samizdat is spot on. You've probably had the same experience that I've had of people who used to live in communist countries decades ago and came here, land of freedom and all that, and they're telling you, boy, I'm getting a really eerie and uneasy sense of familiarity of what I'm seeing and hearing here.
I do.
Stuff I thought I'd left beyond years ago. And of course, I hear that from people too. Yeah, you're right about the samizdat. And of course, we'd already entered months and years ago a kind of a two-tiered reality where, the mainstream media said a certain thing. Yes, they don't have a monopoly on communications, but only what appears on their platforms is a fact, is truth that has to be taken into account by political actors. Anything that appears through alternative sources of information is considered fake news, conspiracy theories, et cetera, et cetera. Even if the proof is presented, it can be safely ignored. So I think we have, but you're right, there are, let's say, low-tech means that people can communicate with. You also have, again, an eerie parallel to the communist period where you have foreign platforms like, let's say Sputnik, that Americans depend on because we can't get the truth from domestic media. So what can we hear from our voices abroad, the same way people in the USSR used to listen to, Radio Liberty or Deutsche Welle or whatever it might be. So there are those parallels as well. The question is, how actionable is that in a social context where everybody, where the seamless narrative coming from the establishment is that didn't happen. Pay no attention to that man behind the curtain. The politicians only pay attention to the things that officially happen. What can the people actually do when they know that what they're saying is not true and they have some sense from these alternative means what the truth is? It's not an actionable truth in a social or certainly not a political context. The other thing I think I point out a very practical question is how do people maintain themselves in this kind of atmosphere? And this is where you get into things like, are we going to have another lockdown? When Joe comes in, he's going to make, Fauci king of everything. We're going to scare the pants off of everybody with a third, fourth, fifth wave of a virus. We're going to further destroy small businesses and independent livelihoods. To what extent can people, go out into the country, start living off the land, have some skills they can market, where they can enter into an economy that's not dependent on the stream of commerce or on the big corporations to the same way that most people are today, where they actually have employers who can be part of the system of control. Well, you said something on social media about this. I'm sorry, you're going to be fired, or you're going to be reprimanded, or you're going to get a lecture from human resources. I think there's so many levers of control that the new establishment, like I say, this kind of woke fascism is going to have on people that we can't even begin to see how tight that's going to be on most of the population, and how demoralizing it will be for a lot of people to basically be forced to admit the truth of things they know are not true as a condition of keeping their jobs, keeping their ability to basically feed their families.
It's sort of Orwellianism democratized. Orwellianism, the predictions of Orwell in 1984 writ large throughout society, mandated culturally, as of course it was in that book. Anyway, we need to go into a break. For those listening, by the way, you will note, of course, the through line between the conversation we were having towards the end of last hour with Jareth Copus talking about localism, obvious parallels in the surface to what we're talking about now with Jim Jodge was just pointing that out. In any event, we need to go into a break. We'll be back in a minute continuing this conversation with Jim. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We'll be right back.
Fault Lines. Tough questions are the most powerful weapon we have. As long as you have questions, we'll keep asking. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
Peer into the future with Political Misfits on Thursdays, when we analyze the latest trends in news, politics, and culture. Catch us on 105.5 in Washington, D.C., or 102.9 or 104.7 in Kansas City. Achtung, baby.
We are talking
24 hours a day, 7 days a week.
You are listening.
We give you the most essential out of the endless information space.
Radio Sputnik, telling the untold. Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined by my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in Washington, D.C. Joining us is James George Jareth, Washington, D.C.-based government and media relations specialist. He is also a licensed attorney in the District of Columbia and in Pennsylvania who has appeared before the U.S. Supreme Court and has previously served as a U.S. diplomat and U.S. Senate staffer. Again, once more, thank you and welcome to the show, James.
Thank you.
One of the interesting aspects of everything that has taken place, especially with your experience in politics and your experience as a diplomat, what effect do you think this has on world perspective? Now, what I mean by that is I look at what took place as a canary in the coal mine. Oftentimes, when we're looking at countries and things that have happened where those countries have declined, we can look back at events that show this was a moment that XYZ happened, and it's not always easy to see it in the moment. But I do think we've been seeing an escalation, be it Occupy Wall Street, be it the protests that were taking place for like Black Lives Matter. And you have this where the Capitol itself has basically taken the hit. I mean, it was only like less than a year ago where police stations were on fire. And so now we've escalated to the Capitol. How is foreign governments perceiving this and the way that they look at the U.S., even from the standpoint of our foreign policy? What effect does all of this, all of these events over the last week have in a foreign policy standpoint?
Well, I saw a report on Deutsche Welle yesterday saying that the German government has a great plan to help us together with the EU to come up with some kind of a democratic solution, a way to stabilize democracy and really get rid of these horrible extremists, by which, of course, they mean, Trump deplorable type people. So, if the Germans are helping us with this, what could possibly go wrong? I don't have a lot of faith that these other countries are going to be much help to anything that's going on here. I think quite the contrary, given how much adversely the entire at least the Western countries really hated Trump and this populism that's going on in the United States, and for that matter, the rise of populism in some European countries. I think there will be a doubling down on this area, on this effort to get rid of any alternative to kind of the woke liberalism, the Great Reset, the kind of Davos plan that seems to be moving forward with breakneck speed. The other question I think we have is that, look, I think domestically we need to recognize that the American Republic, the rule of law, the Constitution, competitive elections at the national level, that's all over, essentially. I don't think we're going back, just like we're not going back to any kind of normal post-COVID with a vaccine. I don't think we're going to go back to normal in terms of normal politics. The question is what comes next, and also how bad are things going to get on the world scene? Let's remember that Donald Trump, for all of his faults, he was the first president in how many administrations that actually did not start any new wars. He's still got a few days left, but let's hope he doesn't do that in his last few days in office. That I don't know that's going to be maintained under a Biden administration. Now, maybe we can clutch at a few straws that, Bill Burns was named the head of the CIA instead of the insane Mike Morell. But then again, we have Victoria Nuland, the cookie FDEU person from Kiev that's coming back to the State Department. The way I see this, at least on the international scene, is that whatever hiccup Trump presented for the foreign policy consensus that is bent on global domination indefinitely into the future, that resistance, that hiccup is now gone, and that the establishment will be fully in control and will want to continue with confronting the Russians, confronting the Chinese, threatening the Iranians, the Venezuelans, whoever. That I think things will get much, much worse on the world stage. I hope I'm wrong.
I don't think you are. And I think that was already in some sense set in place with Biden's election, but with Trump being hit so hard, and the Republican movement as a whole, I would say, is gutted. Trump is effectively dead as a political figure, and the Republican Party has been eviscerated. In 2024, I know that you just said this. I admit I'm sort of cutting against a rather rough grain here and asking this question. You just kind of gave your hand away. But in 2024 and in 2028, in 2022 and in 2026, in upcoming elections, where do you see any alternative political movement coming from? Because my speculation, and I'd love to hear your take on this, Jim. I'm also curious about your take, Jamarl, is that not only Trump as a sort of populist right-wing figure, but any populist candidate, whether they're left, right, or somehow center, is going to have a hard time standing up to the establishment after what happened last Wednesday. And I could go into that, but you guys might already get where I'm coming from. Jim, what's your take?
Oh, absolutely right. At the trial of Charles I, Cromwell reportedly said, "We shall cut off the king's head with the crown on it." And by that he meant, we're not only going to kill the king, we're also going to kill the monarchy. And I think, and especially with these last steps about impeaching Trump in these final days, this is designed to discredit not only him, but all of his followers, the whole populist movement in the United States, and to facilitate a resurgence of the kind of establishment Bush republicanism that would be happy to play second fiddle, me too, to the Democrats in the building of a new woke regime. So now, can that means there can be no Republican alternative in 2024? I don't think it really can for a couple of reasons. One is any of the shenanigans that took place during this election, and I do think this election was stolen, will be repeated again. And the other thing is that I think that the Democrats will move very quickly to try to naturalize and import as many new foreign voters as they can to make sure that it's simply impossible at the national level for the Republicans to win election unless it's somebody approved by them. For example, take a Nikki Haley. Here's somebody, Sebastian Gork calls her America's warrior princess. I mean, here's somebody who would be perfectly happy to go along with the whole woke agenda from the left, but put a Republican face on it. So I think that possibility exists. But more likely, in my opinion, is that we have perpetual Democratic rule at the national level that through various means, both changing the demographics, but also maintaining the lack of integrity in our voting system, it's essentially all over for anything like a challenge to the system that Trump in his unique and rather rough way presented, but was not able to bring to fruition.
I mean, let's be straightforward. The Republicans, for decades had screwed around with the voting apparatus. It's fair to say that the Democratic Party didn't necessarily want to do anything to fix our voting systems, be it transparency or otherwise. Yes, I agree. But that they weren't there alone. The Republican Party, be it interstate cross-check, where they were knocking various people off the voter rolls, the voting ID laws. Yeah, we accept a gun license, but we won't necessarily accept a student license. I mean, these guys gave away their hand on more than one occasion. The gentleman in Pennsylvania, when Obama was running against Romney, and he makes the argument that voter ID laws is going to help Romney take Pennsylvania for the first time in X number of years. You know, this is not just a Democrat or Democratic thing. This seems to be a political thing that has been taking place for years. You don't, like, I guess my thing is, if you want to make the argument that Democrats stole this election, let's be very clear that both are playing in this kind of sandbox of trying to find ways to game the system, whatever percentage that is. You don't take this as a singular thing for Democrats, do you?
I don't think it's singular, but I'm sure that the Republicans have had their share of shenanigans at some point. But I think we're talking about light years of difference. I mean, look, I've monitored elections in foreign countries. You know, most countries do have much stronger ballot integrity than we do in terms of presenting IDs and checking on your citizenship. You know, in no state have the courts allowed the state to require proof of citizenship to register. All you have to do is check a box saying, yes, I'm a citizen, and nobody will check on that to find out if you actually are a citizen. So I think that whatever the sins of the Republicans are in this respect, I think they're like 100 times worse on the Democratic side, because that's how they will win elections. And again, I don't think there's any looking back. I think this is baked into the cake now, and nothing really is going to be done about it.
And another side of this, just kind of tying this back into the topic of the last segment, the de facto topic, at least because I don't think we chose one, but it came out. Information, propaganda, in a deeper sense, the establishment as such, a sort of one-party establishment, a no-party establishment, just a monolithic power center of the United States representing the voices of various oligarchs, that the information black hole where knowledge gets sucked up and occasionally glimmers of propaganda get spat out, that is a constant. So, I mean, even if we set aside for a second in the name of some equanimity, what happened in elections, allegations of election fraud being levied by each side at the other side, the lies by the media are a constant. And like we were saying in the last segment, I don't see how we get out of that one. So whether it's election fraud or in a deeper sense, informational fraud, I think that I really don't know where to go with this one. In terms of any alternative to the current status quo. One side of this, though, and this is one that I'm pretty sure Jamarl would agree with me on, is that America, as it struggles and struggles, as the American government struggles and struggles to suppress all dissent, those are merely signs that on a deeper level, on a sort of structural level, America as a country is stagnating. That is sad, but for those who hope that one day you might be able to reform or revitalize that country, which you would need to do by creating some compelling alternative, some sort of institutional alternative or something like that can do the revitalization, that might be attainable at some point. Do you have any hope for that? You know, do you have any, I don't know if I'm being too vague here, but do you have any hope, Jim, that as the American government sort of struggles to retain control, those are genuine signs that there is an alternative that might be in the making, maybe decades in the future, but still potentially in the making as that government weakens and as some alternative grows stronger? Jim, what's your take?
Well, where there's life, there's hope. So there's always hope. And I guess what I don't see is the pathway. I don't see how that happens. And you're right. Maybe this is like, when communism began in the Soviet Union, it lasted 3 generations or 2 generations in the countries in Eastern Europe. I think part of the difference is at the end of those generations, Russia was still full of Russians. Poland was still full of Poles. I think there will be a very significant effort to transform America's demographics so that we become, basically a very easily divided and ruled hodgepodge that, racially, ethnically, linguistically, religiously, sexually, you just have a myriad of competing tribes all squabbling with each other that is tailor-made to be atomized and controlled by this kind of woke corporate rainbow fascist establishment, that there really isn't any exit at the other end of the pipe as there was with communism in Eastern Europe. So that's my big concern. Now maybe that won't work. I don't know. Maybe there's laid plans of vice and men. Maybe it doesn't work out, that there's some kind of popular resistance that emerges somewhere in a way we can't quite see. But one of the things that does worry me, I think we see this not only with the claims over the election and the kind of division we're getting now, but also what happened to a lot of people when we got the whole COVID lockdown, between those who truly believe that the plague carts are running down the street collecting dead bodies because this is the worst disease that ever hit the entire world. So all these lockdowns and destroying the economy was necessary, versus those who say, this is all crazy. Why are we doing this? I think those divisions exist. And unfortunately, I would say about half the population are essentially NPCs. They believe everything they're told. That when MSNBC or CNN, for that matter, Fox News tells them, black is white, up is down, and so forth, they believe it because they've been told by authority that's what it must be. And any kind of dissenting voice says, oh, well, those people are crazy. That's a conspiracy theory. And there is no wake-up call there's no waking up and smelling the coffee for these people. I think we get a split in the consciousness of the people between those who are good little, good little fascists, Nazis, communists, whatever you want to call them, who believe what the authority tells them, and those who question, and by definition, their questioning makes them dissidents, if not worse.
We have to cut it here. Jim, interesting conversation, dynamic as always. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much.
Those listening, that was the voice of Jim Jareth. He is a Washington, D.C.-based government and media relations specialist, also an attorney licensed in the District of Columbia and Pennsylvania, who has appeared before the U.S. Supreme Court and previously served as a U.S. diplomat and U.S. Senate staffer. And by the way, you can follow Jim on Twitter at Jim Jareth and read his articles at jimjareth.info. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We'll be back taking calls on the other side of this break.
Fault Lines. Catch all the breaking global, political, and economic news as it happens. Sputnik brings an all-star lineup with expert opinion from some of the biggest names in the news today. Noam Chomsky.
Turkey, U.S. ally, their main goal is to attack the Kurds, the one ground force opposing ISIS. And there have been a kind of a funnel for support of ISIS, not officially, but in practice.
Peter Sunde, co-founder of the Pirate Bay.
We don't have any sort of democratic control over the internet. And I think that we're very naive when we think that the internet itself is intrinsically good. It's not. It's just a very neutral technology that is being used for good things, but more and more being used for evil things.
Icelandic Foreign Minister Gunnar Bragi Sveinsson.
Increased activities in the Keflavik airbase, and that has to do with more activities from the Russian Northern Fleet in the ocean around Iceland, and also, of course, these usual flights of the bombers.
Robert F. Kennedy Jr.
We're the ones that destroyed the government of Libya. We're the ones that putting in a pipeline dispute that helped destroy the government of Bashar al-Assad in Syria. We're the ones who invaded Iraq.
Former U.S. Secretary of Defense William Perry.
The hostile relationship between the United States and Russia today is dangerous for both countries, not because either country would actually want to start a military conflict, but because there's always a danger of blundering.
Sputnik talks to the brightest minds in politics and current affairs to find out what's really happening. Tune in. Fault Lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan, and we are taking calls too. 202-521-1320 is the number. Again, that's 202-521-1320. We have Tarif calling in from New Orleans. Tarif, you're on. What's going on?
3-4 things to say. I'm going to be quick. AMLO came out and said what he saw in the United States with Twitter and Facebook corporations banning the president is a bad omen. He said that's not good. And I shared that link with y'all today. Trump, he's on his way out. The best thing he can do, in my opinion, if he can do it, if he have the courage to do it, is give people a chance. If he important joining signs and other whistleblowers, set up committees to look into the assassinations of MLK, Malcolm X, Robert F. Kennedy Jr., Kennedy, the president, Kennedy, John F. Kennedy, COINTELPRO, MK Ultra, Project Montauk. You got to set up special prosecutors for that, and also you have to declass. You got, 8 days left. If you don't do that, then it's going to be kind of hard for everybody. I mean, we're really going to be facing some stuff with this counterterrorism stuff where they're looking at us as being terrorists because we have our own opinion. So that right there in revising 230, not repealing 230, but revising 230, where we can get on these platforms and look into these, the John F. Kennedy assassination and COINTELPRO, then I can explain a lot, and that give us something to look forward in the future. But if you don't do that, then, I don't know what we can do, but keep on pushing forward, That's all I wanted to say today.
Jareth, thank you for the call. That would be, coming back to what you were saying about Trump, that would be good, but I think that's like the last thing on his mind right now. I think that if you were to do it, I don't know if I'm right about this. It might be a step back for the process to do what you're talking about, to declassify those files, simply because Trump at this point is doing it. And I think that anything that Trump touches right now is going to be tainted. Having said that, it's not like Biden is planning on doing that. I don't know during what administration in the future we would see those kinds of releases or those kinds of investigations. I agree that they're needed. Just saying, he ain't going to do it. That's my take on that one. Ron, any take before I move on?
Not entirely. I mean, Trump is such a wild card. I know where Jareth is coming from. The thought is, if anybody would do it, it would be Trump. And like you said, there's no expectation of Biden doing it, none of that stuff. I think the honest truth is, when people get into office, especially when they're not ideological actors, meaning the ideology is, let's say, just to keep going with the traditional prevailing narrative of the capitalistic system, et cetera, in the way that Biden is going to do. I don't necessarily think they want to put a huge amount on their plate where they have to deal with fallout. I don't think they want to have to deal with the actions of that stuff. I think they just want to manage. And putting out, let's say, the Kennedy assassination and those type of things, yeah, if anybody would do it, Trump would be the guy. But I agree, I don't think that's on Trump's mind right now. I don't think that's on his mind. So I think a lot of everything that's happened over the past few days have shifted public attention and public conversation, honestly, even among Trump and his acolytes. I mean, and what happened after that thing, after the march? Trump conceded. Like, he basically, for all intents and purposes, conceded. That's how bad and provocative what took place was, and how shocking it was to watch the Capitol raided like that. So yeah, I don't think that's on his mind, even though I agree with you, Jareth, that if anybody would do it, it would have been him. He just hasn't done it yet, so I don't think he will. That's unfortunate.
I hear you. We're taking calls, 202-521-1320. We have Brave calling in from Atlanta. Brave, thanks for calling. How are you doing this morning, and what's on your mind?
Doing pretty good, guys. A lot of great guests this morning, a lot of great conversation. My concerns are, I've been listening to people talk about, for forever, right? I've been listening to people talk about revolution. And then we have something that's I guess, not we, but yeah, let's say we have something that's similar. But if I'm being completely honest, I felt like it was more of, at worst, a riot, at best, a flash mob. Right, because everybody keeps saying siege and coup. There was no weapons. They had no means of doing it. It was just a big rowdy crowd. And if you have 100,000 plus of people that were actually at the rally, but only a couple thousand actually go into the Capitol. I mean, it's just not what the media is making it out to be, right? But that said, everybody's talking about revolution. Everybody's citing how, our country is moving in this direction where the autocracy is taking over, and there's not going to be any more freedom of speech, and the tech companies are merging, all these like Orwellian things, right? And still, I'm hearing people say, "But that was too far." And I'm just wondering, how do you intend? And I'm saying this to you guys. I'm posing this question to you guys and anyone listening, anyone that has an answer. How do you intend to take power from those who have put themselves in power by destroying, toppling, and slaughtering people and enslaving people? Like, how do you intend? Because there's not going to be a reforming of this government. It's not. It was founded to do what it's doing, so there's not going to be a reforming of it. So I'm just wondering how people intend on seeing this ultimate change come about, without any sense of uprising or violence. And I'm just being 100 with it. And I will go so far as to say I may not agree with their reasons as far as the stop the steal. However, I do believe that the election was stolen. I do believe the election was crooked, and I do believe that if we do not find some sense of camaraderie with these writers or whatever they want to call themselves, because everybody out there wasn't racist. My dad's a Trump supporter, and I'm black. So if we don't find some sense of working together against this government, we definitely won't get anywhere. But still, I pose the question, how do you believe that any change will come about without any uprising or violence? When this nation became a nation by slaughtering people and taking the land. I'm just, please, anybody has an answer for that?
Wait, stay on the line. So you would agree with me then that if this was healthcare, this would have been just. Like the issue, and I think Shane even was like, yeah, it would be just. Whether it's helpful or not is a secondary question, but when you take into account everything that has been going on, when you take into account, let's say, the number of people that have died and everything else, let's put up the election to the side for the moment. Is there enough to justify the public itself getting antsy and basically charging the Capitol? I think the answer is yes. I think the issue that we're having, or the conversation, is basically reason. If the reason was different, I would imagine, based on your conversation, this is just.
You want me to respond?
Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, I do believe it's just. Again, like you just said, there's been plenty enough reason for people to be angry enough, right? And I will answer your question by citing a point that one of you guys made earlier about the left being out there and supporting the action. Let's just say this: the left wouldn't be able to support the action because we spend so much time debating and pontificating and having high-minded conversations and looking down on each other, right? So, and then we don't have the guts to get out and stand for anything unless we have some old guy in front of us telling us what to do. It's not a matter of whether it's healthcare or not. The matter is that our government has failed us completely. So whether I believe that the vote was stolen or I believe that we need healthcare or whatever, it's justified in that. So I personally am happy that it happened. I wish it would have been more serious, but at minimum, at least Congress is a little shaken up, or at least I'm hoping at minimum. I do believe it was justified. I do believe it. It's past justified. It wasn't enough. You yourself make the point that 1,000 people die a year at the hands of police. Our economy is crumbling, destroyed. They gutted the middle class, right? It's past justified. It's been justified. It was justified back in the Black Power movement, moving into the Civil Rights movement. And we're still talking and still debating and talking about forming little local governments. You know, it's ridiculous. It's ridiculous. We are at war. They say it every day. They stated it. They say it. Look at the mission statements. They said it. They are at war with their own population. We are the only ones who are still having conversations. At least the right got enough balls to get together, go out and act.
But it failed completely. But Brave, I mean, what the right did, I mean, Jamarl, you said earlier that it was a success and that it's going to motivate other people to do more. I don't see how any of these things are going to work out. When you're saying you don't see how it can happen non-violently, I have no idea how it can happen violently. You yourself opened up calling in, talking about the intense asymmetry of force now that kill people willy-nilly. So when you're talking about a violent revolution, look at who has the guns. And when I say guns, I mean not just guns, not just artillery, not just naval air forces, the Navy, the Air Force, drones, everything. I don't see how you do it with violence. How the hell does that work? Brave.
Can I respond very quickly? When the Black Panthers came together, when the Black Panthers was standing up against oppression and fascists and this fascist government, and Malcolm X as well, right? They said simply, we will stand for our freedom. We will fight for our freedom by any means necessary. Just that simple. I am not saying that everyone has to get together and form an army and go out and form little small governments and go take action and put together a war plan. But up at minimum. The conversation is cool, but we're past conversation point. We're past the point of conversation. I am not telling us to go rent some tanks and rent some ARs and all stuff and go run at the Capitol firing rounds. But I am saying that where do you expect to get if you are saying from the beginning, I will go no further than just standing here and getting mopped down by your dogs and your fire hydrants and your gas grenades.
Brave, thank you for calling in, man. I appreciate the commentary. And I have to be honest, I agree with more of it than I disagree with. But let's do this. Let's close out. Shane, you still here with us?
I am. Okay. Yeah. Yeah, you've been listening to Fault Lines. Thanks for folks for listening. And Brave, thank you for the call. Thank you to all of our guests. Thank you to producers Cameron and Raheem. Thank you, Jamarl Thomas, for co-hosting the show with me. Thank you, Andre, our engineer. And again, thank you for listening. We'll be back tomorrow, folks. Have a great day. Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan signing off.
Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan, another one in the record books. I have to be honest, my feelings on the protest was very strange. In one part of me, and the reason why I asked the question this morning, and maybe we're even treading on dangerous territory, even asking the question, is because on the day that it happened, 4,000 people died of COVID. And the 4,000 people didn't die because all 4,000 was doing something wrong. They didn't die because each of the people, were making themselves available and susceptible to the illness and everything else. Those people died because the government of the United States basically dropped the ball. It didn't deal with the real material concerns of the public itself. It didn't deal with the finances to ensure that the people had money. You had a group of people who haven't gotten the first $1,200. And over the course of months, you had a government shutting down various businesses with Congress fighting back and forth for political reasons, withholding up to $1.8 trillion from hitting the economy. And then with the propaganda arm of Democrats going on MSNBC and CNN basically saying, hey, everything is great. We don't need this extra cash and stimulus in the economy anymore. What happened at Friday? 160,000 jobs lost or something to that effect? For the first time in months, we went backwards. But yeah, of course, the propaganda that nobody needs the cash anymore. No, what Brave is saying, man, is so on point. And that's kind of why I asked the question. Part of me watches that and thinks to myself, oh God, that's horrifying. But the reason why I say it's horrifying has everything to do with the reason and rationale that they're doing it, not that it's happening. There's a difference in those things. There's a massive difference in those things. So I feel where Brave is coming from. I feel the anger. I get all of that. My concern and the thing that bothers me is that it was being done more so to try to keep Trump in power at the exact time where 4,000 people were dropping dead because of Trump's malfeasance in dealing with the virus. But if that public was there because they were angry that 400,000 people have died, that 4,000 more than died on 9/11 on that particular day, that the hospitals weren't given the resources that they needed, that the public was basically being hit, not able to increase their wages, while the upper 1% and everything in their associations with the political, meaning you had reasons, you had great and monstrous reasons to be angry and upset at the governmental structure itself. The issue is the reason that they went and the ludicrous nature of the reason that they went. But the moment that you give a stat like 400,000 Americans died over the course of a year, and they don't even ensure that health care is offered, that in and of itself, by itself, everything else off the table, is enough of a reason to protest, is enough of a reason to march, and is enough of a reason to make congressmen uncomfortable in a way that they haven't had to deal with being uncomfortable. So no, I don't support these lunatics in the way that they went about it. But if the opinion changed, meaning if the context changed, and if this was about something that was significant and pressing, especially from the standpoint of Americans across the board, then how is it not just? How would it not be just? Intermediary Fossil. Thank you, Intermediary Fossil. Matt W. Power is the problem. No power. No problem. Power is the problem, and the ability to take that power is the problem. You have a tin-pot populace who's not really a populace at all, who's able to get the crowd whipped up into a frenzy like this. And you can't even get a vote on Medicare for all. Like, think about that for a moment. You can't get them to force a vote on Medicare for all when the right wing has basically sieged the Capitol. Stop there. Forcing the vote, that's too much. That's too hard. That's too difficult. That's too intense. That's not going to come to any ends. That's the left. That's the comically ridiculous left. And yet, you have the right wing sieging the Capitol of the United States, walking through the Capitol with a Confederate flag, making it very clear that there are people who are either in the military and in our police force that gave tacit approval to what was taking place. Wins beget wins, and I guarantee you they consider that a win. And the left cannot even get a vote on Medicare for all. To put this in perspective, 88% of Democrats backed Medicare for all. 74% of the public backed Medicare for all. You're in a pandemic. You have nearly 400,000 people that have dropped dead. 4,000 people dropped dead on the day that they sacked the Capitol. And 20 million infected. And then you have the secondary consequences from people who die because they can't get into the hospital, family members that can't see their loved ones as they go about passing, again, because they can't get into the hospitals, other diseases and viruses, in fact, and medical conditions not being seen because they can't get into the hospital. And not to mention companies that have gone belly up, or retail that have gone belly up, the employees that worked at those retail that have gone belly up, and many of those people were already at the rough ends of our economy. And you're telling me that that's not reason and just cause to be angry and upset? I think it is. But instead, we got the comically ridiculous run on Washington for the reason of installing and maintaining Trump. We have all sorts of reasons to be pissed off and angry. And for whatever reason, that anger seems to be expressed more full-throatedly on the right, at least in real terms of making people uncomfortable. It seems that the left, for whatever particular reason, doesn't have that capacity. And maybe the difference is when it's coming from the left, it's expressed in these kind of racial terms as opposed to class-based terms. Meaning, what happens if the Black Lives Matter protest is about poverty as opposed to race? What happens when all of the people coming out that are white, black, gay, straight, etc., when they are finding the fastest thing moving, and it is basically the Black Lives Matter protest, with blacks being shot by cops and little to no consequences being distributed? The sick part of that, it's not just blacks that are being shot by cops. The majority are white. The only difference is from the standpoint of percentages, and from the standpoint of percentage of the people who don't get justice, it trends to people of color. I'm asking something a little bit different. With all of the qualms and the problems that are associated with your country, especially within 2020, where it seems like they utterly and entirely dropped the ball, where if you had the impression that your government didn't give a shit about you, 2020 was the year that it became abundantly clear that you were absolutely, indubitably right. Why shouldn't you be pissed off? You should be. That's my point. You should be. The issue wasn't that they raided Congress. The issue was the reason that they raided Congress. There needs to be an understanding that there is a difference in those things. And I get that this is somewhat of an edgy point of view to take, but there's something to be said that there are some protests that are good when the reason is good, and they're bad when the reason is bad. This one, the reason was utterly ridiculous. If they were bright, what they should have did was said and added healthcare to it, added the number of people that died to it, added the number of people that were ill and infected with the virus, added the number of people that were potentially going to be evicted. If you look back over history, the Nazis were bright enough to add socialist elements into their party in order to get people to join in, where you had elements on the right and elements on the left basically jumping into one party. The point of it wasn't to do any of those things associated with what they were putting out there. The point of it was just to accrue the masses, to accrue power. Fortunately, they weren't bright enough to do that. I am making the point that from the standpoint of the left, we need to be far more full-throated in pushing for the healthcare issue. You've had 400,000 people basically drop dead. Raising your voice is not the issue. Like, share, and subscribe. You guys may see me later. I had to have surgery on Friday, and so I'm still painting right much. So you may see me later, you may not. If nothing else, you would definitely see me Tuesday and going forward, but it depends on how the pain meds work. I want to say like, I'm going to say share, and I'm going to say subscribe. Thanks all.